Hello, everyone. Books with Thanks back again, and I am so grateful to be joined by a critical dragon, in some circles known as Professor Fireballs. AP, thank you so much for coming on my channel today. How are you?
I am doing very well, Alex. Thank you very much for inviting me. Like, this is a lot of fun. Before we even get started, one of the things that Alex had said was, "Would you be interested in talking about narrative theory and narratology?" And I'm like, "Would I? Of course!" Like, I have an entire channel where I talk about this stuff. Whereas, obviously we may talk about Malazan stuff, but when someone says, "Would you like to talk about narrative and narrative theory?" You're like, yeah. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
And yeah, as I kind of touched on, thank you so much for being here. First time I've had a guest on the channel, and I just feel really honored to have someone that is such an expert, I guess, in the field and in the stuff that I'm really starting to get into, like narrative theory. But I guess like even before we get into any kind of questions I had for you, I see these terms narrative theory and then narratology thrown around a lot. So is there much of a difference between the use of those terms? Are they basically synonymous?
There's when you get into semantic arguments, narrative theory is detailing theories specifically about narrative. Literary theory is theories about literature in general and applied to literature. And then narratology is part of structuralism, an offshoot of structuralism. So a school of literary theory, structuralism, has an offshoot narratology, which uses different theories within it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, for the vast majority of people, literary theory, narrative theory, those are basically synonyms. Narratology is a specific sort of sub-school that owes its lineage to structuralism and is an offshoot of structuralism. But at the end of the day, like so many of these things, unless you're delving deep into specifics, um, if it's just informal conversation, if I said narrative theory or literary theory, most people would kind of go, well, that's not specific. He's talking more about literary theory than narrative theory. You go, but at the end of the day, most people are following the argument, not the label you've used.
Okay.
So it's potato, potato, I believe is the expression.
All right, fair enough.
It's not a big thing.
Okay. So I guess maybe I'm curious, and I'm sure other fans of yours might be curious too, how you came to enjoy narrative theory, how you came to start studying it. Was that what you when you started your higher education, when you started graduate studies, like was that always what you were planning on looking into or going into?
No, like a lot of people, when I studied English literature, I was woefully ignorant of different literary theories and different approaches to analyzing narrative. Now, like I obviously in high school, I had a brilliant English teacher who, people talk about, oh, I had one of those teachers who just inspired me.
Right.
I had one of those teachers, and she was my English teacher. It was Mrs. Duffy. And I would not have ended up doing the stuff that I did were it not for Mrs. Duffy. So you can all blame her for the fact that I've ended up doing videos on YouTube. But she was a teacher who really inspired me. And she was very much of a school of close reading, the text and nothing but the text. And that is actually part of a whole movement of literary criticism. But at the time, I was completely and utterly unaware that this was a specific form of literary criticism. I thought this was how you studied literature. And so, because that was such a heavy focus in her practice of teaching literature, that became my default mode for a lot of studying literature and how I approach things. I was close reading, not looking into the biography of the author, trying to separate the author from the text itself and look solely at the text and the whole death of the author, and without understanding it. This was just what I was doing because this is how I thought it was done when I was in high school. And then, of course, when I ended up studying literature, people went, oh, so now we're going to do a class, a module on different literary theories. Theories, plural. There are different ways to do this. And got introduced to the idea of different approaches and different lenses that could be applied, different ways of thinking about a text, different ways of thinking about the act of reading. And even then, like new developments being made, like reader response theory was not a popular mode of considering literature when I first started studying. It was a relatively, for the lectures that I knew and in the programs I was in, was a relatively minor thing that was occasionally referred to, but I knew nothing about. And it was only in grad school when I was looking up further things that I went, oh, reader response theory actually explains a lot of this stuff. And it leans into and acknowledges this aspect of reading, which then can tie back into aspects of structuralism and then can tie into this. And suddenly you realize, or at least I realized for me, a lot of what literary theory does is it gives you, it takes a discrete aspect of what we do when we read and focuses on it. It tries to find its limits. It tries to find the mechanism through which it works. And so, because I was a textual analyst first, my approach to literary theory, much to the chagrin of a number of my friends, was, yeah, theory's useful and all, but really it only ever serves your analysis. And I always got the impression that a number of them, they started with the theory going, well, this theory is saying this thing, so I'm going to investigate the theory and then find aspects of it in a book. And I go, but if you start that way, you're always going to find aspects of it, because if you choose that lens to begin with, then it's going to highlight the things that fit that framework. But if you start with the text first and think about the different theories and sort of cycle through them and use them as a toolkit, you end up extracting lots of different information and seeing how the text kind of works. And so I think, in part, my particular inclination, even though Mrs. Duffy drilled into us the text and nothing but the text, start with the text, even though she taught us that, my natural inclination was always to veer towards structuralism, was to veer toward patterns, was to think about things in the abstract, and to sometimes strip away a lot of the individuality that made that specific story function, but to strip some of that away to see what the underlying patterns and structures and movements were. And ultimately, what I have found is everything in moderation. Being able to close read is an enormous skill, enormously useful skill. Being able to recognize structures and movements, to recognize how rising action is being created, how tension is being created. That is a combination of not only the words on the page, but the order those words are in, the use of sentence length to play with pacing, paragraphs to play with pacing, chapter length to alter all of these things, movements about choice of narrative position and narrative perspective. These things all affect how we understand what's on the page. And then applying things like, I've heard people go, oh, feminist literary theory, and they hear the word feminist and for whatever reason have a problem with it. You go, but all of these things are ways of focusing on specific aspects of text to help us understand what is on the page. Because if you think of a novel that's 140,000 words long, it is very difficult to hold 140,000 words in your head in the correct order, in the correct sequence, and understand all of it as this sort of singular entity. We understand things by breaking them apart. We understand things by cutting them up into bite-sized chunks. And the various lenses that we can apply help us do that. They help us dissect a text to understand it, to reduce it in size into manageable chunks, that then once we've done that, we can recombine it all we can re-assimilate all of that in our minds, and we get a greater sense of the whole. We get a greater understanding of it. But in order to do that, you need people to specialize in singular approaches, to advance the boundaries, to really work on it, to explore exactly what it is, to get the terminology that helps us frame very nuanced points and understand the distinction. Because, as a simple illustration, we have the terms hero, protagonist, main character. Well, they all mean basically the same thing. Why don't we just use one? Because by using the different terms, we can give slightly different meaning to each of them. And that helps us with a more nuanced take on something. And then you go, well, hero, villain, there's your dichotomy. Well, what about anti-hero? Oh, well, that's because, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than just straightforward hero and villain, isn't it? And you go, yeah, because literature's complicated. And the more words and terms that we have helps us refine our approach and understanding. But there's a danger to that as well, which China Mieville gave a brilliant speech one time about the intoxicating allure of subgenreification. And he generated, like in this talk that he was giving, he just started listing. They started with fantasy and then started breaking it down further and further into all of these subgenres of fantasy and sub-subgenres of those subgenres. And he kept going. And it was one of the greatest breakdowns of this, where it was just people inventing terms for, I found this one book and it does this thing. So I'm going to coin a phrase for what it does. And we've seen this with, is this hope punk? And you go, well, how is it punk? Cyberpunk, we can understand because it was about the punk aesthetic and what punk was standing for, in combination with the sort of cybernetics and the cyber future and looking at technology, which is not what punk was doing. So it was a cyber form of punk. They go, hope punk. Well, what's punk about it?
Right. Punk is it just a new suffix? Like, is it just yeah.
That or when we talk about grimdark, and people go, oh well, it came from 40k, and you go, congratulations, yes, I know it came from 40k, but do you know what 40k was? It was a parody, it was an exaggeration. Ralph Blutax has a fantastic video on his channel where he actually goes into the history of the term grimdark, but that's not what it means now. And that's, even understanding what it is in 40k, you need to understand the aesthetic that was driving a lot of literature in the UK at the time during the era of Margaret Thatcher and this economic recession and a lot of the turmoil that was economic turmoil that was happening. That there was a reaction to that. There was also a reaction to Tolkien and that sort of Moorcock-driven fantasy as a reaction to Tolkien and what people thought fantasy should be, just copying Tolkien. There were a whole load of different things filtered into this that it generated. To call it a movement at the time is probably too broad, but there was a beginnings of something of a new way of approaching it, looking at a darker, grittier form. But we also saw in the 1980s the rise of like the very violent action movie. Right. Where action and violence became synonyms. That's an action movie, so it had someone shooting a lot, and you go, but action is not always shooty stuff. But that was the rise of the big blockbuster action movie, and that dominated things. We became desensitized a lot to violence that we needed, particularly in literature, greater and greater and more not gratuitous, graphic violence to achieve the same effect, the same shock value, because we were seeing more and more graphic violence on television, and not just in films, but on television as a standard. And so there are so many different cultural elements that feed into things that as soon as you start picking at it, it becomes enormously complex. And you then are staring at this massively complex and you go, how do I deal with this? And that takes us back to the different theories. You start using the theories and the critical lenses to start taking it apart piece by piece, to put the pieces together to gain a greater understanding. And you will never be able to adequately describe the full picture, but at least you can hopefully get to grips with some of the key aspects of it.
Okay. Thank you. Now I don't necessarily mean to want to ask you to like date yourself or anything. But would you mind sharing like when you were or like the time frame of when you were in school and when you were studying narrative theory? Or if not that, at least like names and like theorists that were like really prominent around that time.
No, it's I it was the early 2000s when I started studying literature at university.
Okay.
And I did an undergraduate degree, I did my master's in science fiction, and then I went on to do the PhD. So that's the sort of time frame. The early to 2010, that sort of era, in and around there. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, yeah.
But
Perfect. Perfect.
but to be perfectly honest, there was a narratologist at the University of Liverpool where I was working, and he introduced me to certain aspects. And then there was Peter Wright. So it was Nick Davis at the University of Liverpool, and then Peter Wright at Edge Hill University, who introduced me to a lot of genre theory from like film. Particularly, a lot of genre texts were written about the Western, the first readily identifiable mainstream genre text that developed its own language, its own conventions, established very specific tropes and used them in certain ways, and then went through a period of deconstruction. And if you think of when the Western rose to prominence and when media studies, because back in the 80s, oh, media studies, what, or you just watch TV in the same way people talk, oh, literature, oh, like you just sit and read books.
That's right.
The ignorance about what you actually learn on these courses is sometimes stunning. But with the rise of film and the technicalities of film and how it actually created narrative, you can see that the Western was an excellent unit of knowledge, a discrete unit of knowledge, where we could see the beginnings of it starting in cinema. We could see it evolve and sort of perfect itself. We could then see its deconstruction. And then we could even see the beginnings of nostalgia-driven Westerns that were made solely with the intention that you grew up with Westerns. And I think, our current sort of cultural space is being dominated, particularly in media forms, by superhero shows. And ultimately, we're now seeing a lot of deconstructed superhero narratives. The Boys on Amazon is an excellent example. But, we can go back to Watchmen, Alan Moore's Watchmen, to see it in print. Zack Snyder's film adaptation of Watchmen, in some regards, does a slightly different thing with Watchmen than the print version did. So
I maybe you would argue it sort of undoes some of what the print version did. Yeah.
That would certainly be Moore's interpretation.
Okay. I like the film a lot, and I really like the graphic novel too. So
but they in some respects they are radically different, even though it's the same narrative events. In fact, like the comic book quite infamously served as the storyboarding for a lot of the shots that Snyder used. But his use of slow motion, his use of how he moved the camera, what he chose to focus on, how he emphasized things, that actually changes the tone and message of the film. From something that is highly critical of the fascistic nature of these vigilante superheroes and is very critical of them, to something that is almost glorifying might be too strong a word, but it's certainly there's admiration in the power of the superheroes, I think, in Zack Snyder's version, which I don't think was what Alan Moore was trying to get at. And by altering the ending of the narrative, Snyder created something that works for the sort of the more literal, and I will say this in inverted commas, realist form of narrative than what Moore's zany, strange, squid monster thing.
Alien creature, yeah, creature.
But that misses the point of, well, who created it? Who created this thing? And it was scientists and authors, and it was people coming together from different walks of like creative pursuits that were understanding these things. Whereas in Snyder's version, it's no, I just manipulated the public perception of this guy as a threat.
Right, right.
Right. Okay. It's not about the power of narrative in the sense of these authors and about engineers coming together and designing something and what the limits of human imagination, pushing past the limits of human imagination. It's only when we work together that we can actually create the future. And that can be used for good or ill. And it's all dependent on framing. And Snyder went in a different direction, which for one reading of the text makes perfect sense for what Snyder was doing. On the other hand, changes aspects of the narrative. But
I
but we
actually,
can
sorry. No,
no no
I was just gonna say I really respect the HBO. I think it only got one season, but the HBO season kind of sequel or TV sequel to Watchmen, I felt like was much more in line with what Alan Moore was going for with the original graphic novel than what Zack Snyder did. Um, yeah,
and again with adaptation, it's not always about replicating what an author did. That Zack Snyder produced a really interesting, very good adaptation.
oh yeah,
Is it what Alan Moore envisaged? No, it's not. Alan Moore envisaged a comic book, and he envisaged it telling the story in a certain way with a certain type of pacing and a certain reader reception. Zack Snyder adapted that and created his own narrative based on Alan Moore's work. He kept a lot of the superficial elements, but changed a lot of the tone, the style, the pacing is different. How it comes across. He altered a lot of things to tell his version of the story and to tell his own personal story that he wanted to tell with that material. It's still a good adaptation. It's an excellent film. But if you're talking about it in terms of how a lot of people talk about adaptation now, but is it good because it accurately reflects the source text? You know, in a lot of respects, no, it doesn't. But that's why I argue against describing fidelity to source text as this. People seem to assume it's this very superficial. Did he copy the events? If he did, then that is good. Like that's it's not what adaptation is. But what I was trying to get to with this point is in about 20 years' time, people will study the superhero phenomenon exactly the same way that we studied the Western, because it will eventually collapse. All of these movements collapse eventually. All genres and subgenres rise and then fall. All forms of narrative rise in popularity and then tail off in popularity. That is just the nature of what happens. So eventually superheroes will no longer dominate. And we'll go, why was everyone so obsessed with superheroes? Like that's just in the same way, like a lot of people watching Westerns now I go, but like how could you ever like a Western? I want to watch The Mandalorian. And you go, you're literally watching a Western. Why are people so obsessed with fantasy? I like science fiction. I want to watch Star Wars. You are literally watching a fantasy story that is dressed in science fiction.
Yeah.
Any,
any forecasting or prophecies for what the next, I guess, Western, then superhero, then what's the next subgenre gonna be?
I don't think anything will be easy to predict in that sense.
Sure.
Like, if you had to put, when did romantic comedies rise to their highest level? And you sort of go, well, probably sometime in the 90s, early 2000s.
Right. Kate Hudson kind of like
but you
And
sort
even
of
the
go,
teen high school kind of teen movie sort of era. Yeah.
well, and how much of that was because we were teens at that time when, and we go, well, there were lots of teen movies then. And you go, yeah, when we were teens, and therefore those are the movies that we were watching, and we
Right.
didn't pay attention to the other movies that were out.
Right.
And and this goes to how our the limits of our perception can so radically alter what we are looking at, and it's we are grossly ignorant in terms of lack of knowledge,
Right.
not in that pejorative sense of like making fun of someone. Oh, you're so ignorant. No, no, but ignorant as in like lack of knowledge about something. That we quite often are limited to our own experience. And you could say, oh, comic books are dying because you've heard someone say it, or you don't see as many comic book stores now as you used to. And yet, when you look at the comic book sales, you go, well, actually, they're making. I think Marvel and DC are making more money now than they had, or they're selling more comic books now. But they're not selling them in the same way. Things have changed. It's like, oh, manga is completely it's taken over the marketplace, and you go, well, if you read a lot of manga, yeah.
Right. Right.
Um, if you read a lot and you see it, then you're going to go, I see it all over the place. And you go, well, I don't, because a lot of the places where I go don't have manga on the shelves. That's not what they sell. We go, oh, fantasy is such an important genre. Fantasy is a tiny genre in comparison to thriller and in comparison to well, actually, yeah, thriller is probably one of the big ones, but also romance is one of the largest, most popular, best-selling genres in the world, and has been for years, for decades. Romance regularly outsells fantasy uh, without breaking a sweat,
Right.
without breaking the sweat off Leary Chatterley's lover. And it's just because people like reading romances, and they always will. But when we read a lot of fantasy, we become invested in that subgenre. We know more about that subgenre and less about other genres of fiction. And because of that, that skews our perception. And like even with movies, when people talk about, oh, every movie coming out is always a superhero movie, there's so much superhero stuff. There's a lot of other stuff as well. Um, there really is, but a lot of media discourse is dominated by the blockbuster, and because we see that, we note that, we think that that is the media landscape, and we forget that no, there's a lot of other things as well.
I saw a sort of on that point, I saw a really interesting, I forget what corner of YouTube it was in, but it was about television and movies and things like that. And someone was commenting on what one of the most successful recent um, television series and programs was in the last few years. And they're talking about the show Yellowstone, but a lot of younger generations, like it, all of its, I guess, data on like Twitter and any other like social media kind of platforms, no one that uses those sites is really talking that much about Yellowstone. So there are whole generations that don't understand how impactful and how popular a series like that is. So I find that whole sort of thing really interesting. Yeah.
And that's the thing, is we can become uh, people talk about echo chambers. I think it's usually used in a very specific sense. But I think a way of thinking about it that doesn't invoke that language is, if we limit the input of information to specific social media sites, and you go, but this is what everyone is talking about. You go, everyone is talking about where? On Twitter. And what are the demographics of the users of Twitter? How does it generally skew? And then of that, your feed, how is that curated? Because that will skew your information further. And it's a bit like, oh, this book on Goodreads. And you go, right. So who uses Goodreads? Oh, well, lots of people do. And you go, yeah. But if we were looking at the demographics of Goodreads, there's going to be a distribution, and it's going to skew in a certain direction. And it's not skewing towards people above the age of 50. That's not the heavy end of the people using Goodreads.
Right.
But that doesn't mean people over the age of 50 don't use Goodreads. But that's not the majority of the users. And so if that is your input data, you're skewing towards a very specific audience. And if you, like, I heard people complaining about the new TV show Willow. And they were going, oh, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. This. And you go, it's a teen show on Disney Plus aimed at teens.
Right.
And
Right.
you're a 40-something man. Why do you think it should cater to your preferences? Like, you're not really the demographic that this show is being aimed at. Like, you do realize that. And we sometimes forget, particularly with this movement towards franchises, and that how that has absolutely changed the shape of storytelling and our approach to understanding storytelling. Franchises have done enormous damage to narrative, particularly in the public consciousness. But you sort of go, oh, I was a fan of Transformers when I was a kid. And you go, right. And that latest Transformers thing was really dumb. And you go, yeah, when you were 8 years old, you loved Transformers.
Right.
Are you 8 years old now? No. Did you watch it with an 8-year-old? Well, yes. Did they like it? Oh, they loved it. Do you think maybe it's not that the film was dumb, but maybe it wasn't aimed at you? It was aimed at the 8-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm one of the Transformers fans. They should have made something for me. And you go, sometimes we age out of things. No, that doesn't mean that there aren't narratives created that can be enjoyed by adults and children alike. Like, a lot of the Pixar movies are eminently watchable as an adult that you enjoy, but you enjoy in a different way to a kid. A kid is liking it for different reasons.
Right. My favorite scene now is when Buzz tries to jump off the banister over the stairs, and that was I hated that scene when I was a kid. So yeah. So
but like all of these things, it's part of it is, I think we have now gotten to the stage where we equate, if I enjoy it, it is good. If I dislike it, it is bad. And you go, that's not how criticism works. That has moved entirely into the what people on YouTube call like the reading experience. That's about your reading experience. It's not about the text. When people say, "Oh, the politics of this film," we've seen a lot, particularly because I was talking about comic book movies, but in comic book movies, and they're talking about, oh, and now they're bringing in diversity and this, right? But you do realize that when they changed Nick Fury from a white guy to Samuel L. Jackson, there was furor at the announcement of this, and then when everyone saw Samuel L. Jackson in the role, they went, "No, like, it's Samuel L. Jackson. He's cool,
right.
And it's awesome." And the complaints about diversity weren't raised then, because the people who'd initially complained about it obviously forgot about the David Hasselhoff Nick Fury movie.
I haven't seen it, but I've seen the posters, like the cover of it. But yeah.
And you go David Hasselhoff or Samuel L. Jackson. I'll take Samuel L. Jackson, thank you very much.
Even just playing himself, like. Yeah.
Or when we watch Shawshank Redemption, and the character of Red is played by Morgan Freeman. Ah, yes, Morgan Freeman, who is very Irish.
Right.
But they got Morgan Freeman, and you go, it doesn't matter that the character was meant to be Irish, because Morgan Freeman plays the essential nature of the character, the role and the function that he was meant to be in the story, and it's Morgan Freeman. He was awesome.
Right.
Or complaining about a female lead, and you go, but Alien and Aliens both had Sigourney Weaver as Ripley. Initially written in Alien, in the script of Alien, Ripley was a male character. And I think it was at the suggestion that Sigourney Weaver said, well, can I just play the character as it's written, but we'll just make Ripley female? And Okay.
Sure.
And so Ripley was written as a male character played by a woman. And it's one of the reasons why she is such a well-rounded, developed character, because she wasn't written as a, oh, I'm going to put in a female character. It was, here is the character first, because the default actually quite a lot of the time was there were male characters, and then it's, oh, and now we're going to write in a love interest, or
Okay.
now we're going to write in a side character. That the default was to think of male characters as leads. And yet, when you just have a female actor play them, you go, was there anything about that character that was intrinsically male? And Gina Davis and Sandra Bullock and a number of leading Hollywood female actors have made great inroads into proving how good scripts can be if a female actor plays a male role. And people don't notice, because when we see it, we go, oh, it was obviously written for them.
Right.
But they're not being written with classic or silly female tropes being embedded into the writing. And it's fascinating, because with the superhero movies, there's this whole thing, oh, well, now they're suddenly doing this. And you go, well, the majority of the films are not suddenly changing, because when it's, what is it, like 32 Marvel projects that have been done, and the majority of them are still quite well led.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's having a slight uptick in diverse representation of telling different stories within the subgenre, that they are not all male-led action superhero movies. That we got Miss Marvel, which wasn't an action superhero movie. It was a TV show looking at a different aspect and using the superhero genre to tell that story. Was it New Mutants was a horror that they did using superheroes. Brightburn, again, that was an independent one that was meant to be like a dark Superman story. But again, using superhero and turning it into a horror. Ant-Man was a comedy.
Right. Comedy heist kind of, yeah.
It's superhero is not always the action adventure. Here is the origin, then they go and fight the bad guy. That's one form of superhero. But you look at The Boys. The Boys took the source material, Garth Ennis's comic books, and gender flipped some characters, race flipped some characters, changed the backstory of a whole lot of the characters, changed elements of the world building, moved narrative events around, took stuff from it was about volume 3 of, because I have the collected version of it. About volume 3 was when a lot of the Starlight storyline came in, and they put it in season 1. And they moved stuff around, they developed it. And you go, yeah, it's an excellent adaptation. It is superhero, and it's deconstructing superhero, and it's doing all of these things. But it seems that that doesn't raise the same ire that some of these other properties do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I guess maybe kind of building off of that, you had mentioned earlier that superhero, or the superhero franchise, and just cinematic franchises in general, and the franchise poses a lot of problems for narrative. And do you mean that it poses a lot of problems from the theory end, or just from the artist like creating those narratives, or yeah, I guess if you could maybe elaborate a little more on some of those some of the problems there.
Okay, so we have a whole lot of interrelated things here.
Okay.
And the first is the economic landscape for media has changed. Mid-range movies are kind of being edged out of the market. A big studio can put 200 million or 100 million or 200 million into a big blockbuster and make back $1 billion. So they make a lot of money. And in fact, if you have 3 of those tentpoles that make $1 billion, you can afford to have a couple that fail miserably, because you are making ludicrous amounts of money, although you're only making 4 times the value of the film. Like if it costs 200,000 or 200 million and you get 800 million back, you've made 600 million.
Mm-hmm.
You made 3 times the amount. If you get 1 billion back, then you've made 800 million. So you've made 4 times. But if you made a film for 70 million and it brought back 60 million, or if you made it for 70 and it brought back, say, 250,000, it didn't cost you anywhere near the same amount. And in fact, your value of return could be similar, but you're not making the same amount. With the rise of streaming, instead of theater release, international release, both being box office is generating money, then the home DVD, or it used to be the VHS market, where again there would be sales, and then there was network TV. So anytime it was shown, that was generating revenue. There were all of these different elements of subsidiary revenue or sequential revenues feeding into things. Now we have the thing gets released and then it gets shown on streaming. So they pay like a one-off license for it. You don't get years of money coming back in.
Right.
And even DVD sales. People, oh, well, I can still buy DVDs. But DVD sales have dropped because streaming has become so ubiquitous that there are all these streaming services. So why clutter up your house with these plastic boxes full of discs? Now that we have smart TVs and they're plugged into the internet, and you can just go, oh, I feel like watching that, and suddenly it's just on your TV without you having to go and buy it.
Right. The only hassle is figuring out which streaming service it's on.
So that's changed a lot of the economic aspects of it. And so it makes people, I think, in Hollywood a little conservative in where they're putting their money, because if you lose 40 million on a project, a lot of these studios can stomach that. But if you have a couple of 200 million stinkers, that can sink a studio.
Right.
And these some of the projects that were getting made may not have ever made it back in the cinema, but they would have made it back in all of these other different aspects. But added to that, obviously, we had the pandemic, and that stopped people going to the cinema. And when people fall out of the habit of something, it is hard to get them to go back to it.
Mm.
And cinema numbers are still down. And that's not because there are no good films in the cinema. There's, well, we'll get onto that in a minute. But people fell out of the habit of going to the cinema. Some people may still be a bit, well, no, I'll stay in. And now, because it is so easy to get these things on streaming, you go, oh, well, there's no point in going to the cinema. It'll be out on streaming in a couple of months. And we even got used to this shortened time frame between when it was released in the cinema and then suddenly when we could just get it on our TVs. And our TVs are now, you can get these TVs that are the size of a wall, like Fahrenheit 451, eat your heart out. We have now done that because we took that as a blueprint and not a warning. That we have these high def TVs that are huge and fill up like a massive chunk of real estate on our walls. And we have surround sound. We have all of these entertainment systems now to bring the cinema into our home. And so technology is now making that experience easier to access in our own home, so we don't have to go out for it then either. So those things add to it. So it can make filmmakers a little bit shy, a little bit wary about taking a chance on something new. And so what do you fall back on? You go, well, something like the superhero stuff. You go, there's a franchise. That one was successful. Let's make another one in that because we know it works. We know there's an audience. It's not quite a sure thing because they will not all. So that was entirely my fault that there was suddenly a break in this because my internet died. when I am talking to other people, it's usually not my fault, but this time entirely my fault. So I know I was rambling about Hollywood and how there've been changes to things that make franchises more attractive because it's a more conservative position. You're more likely to have a safe bet because it's well known, it's easier to market. You have a pre-established fan base that are at least likely to check some of it out.
Mhm.
Even if you're aiming at a broader demographic, bring new people in because you need new bums on seats in order to make the money back. Right? And you want to create lifelong fans. You want to create people who are going to buy the merchandising after the fact. And it's easier then with a franchise to create a multimedia uh, ecosystem of different things, different tie-ins, where it's uh, get someone hooked on Marvel movies, and you go, they buy the Funko Pops, and they buy the action figures, and they buy you get the bed sheets and the duvet covers and the lunchbox and the flask
The
and
Legos.
the stickers
Yeah.
and the decals and and suddenly there's a mass media machine behind it for which the film is just the on ramp. It's just the feeder into this giant machine of capitalist consumerism. And Hollywood's always been capitalist and it's part of the system. But with the focus on that, it's why don't people take more risks? Well, when they take risks and they don't work out, studios die, production houses die. And therefore, why would you take the risk? Well, in my day, it's not our day anymore. It is a new day with a new media landscape, a new technology landscape, a new consumer landscape. And added to this, streaming has actually changed how a lot of writers learn their craft and their trade. If you think network TV, 24 episodes of in a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you'd start production and you'd maybe get through the first half of the season. The first 12 episodes would be, they'd have been written, they'd have been filmed, they'd have been edited, and in the can before the first one airs. But as soon as the first one airs, you're working on the second half, the second half of the season. So there would have been the mid-season hiatus. But you had 12 and then 12 or 10 and 10. But it was roughly like a year-long sort of project, but there was a mid-season hiatus. And so it followed a pattern. But because of that, the writers were employed all year round. You got your job, you were in the writer's room, and you were writing the first 12 episodes. And then when they started filming the first 12 episodes, the director might call the writer's room and say, listen, we're having an issue with it. Can you send one of the writers down? So they would go down, they'd be on set. And they'd be spending time on set with the cast and the crew and the costume designers and the set designers and the location scouts and the directors and the camera operatives and the cinematographer. And because they were on set, because there was this constant year, you had a year-long job, you had job security.
Uh-huh.
And in the States, medical insurance
Right.
and a steady income and all of these things. And then because it was being produced while you were writing the second half of the season, you were getting feedback on how things were being made. So every writer, a junior writer just starting out, this was their first writing job. They were learning on the job. There was mentorship. There was someone leading the writer's room. There was interaction with all of the different parts of production. But now when you think of streaming and they go, right, it's a 6-episode miniseries or it's an 8-episode miniseries. But the writers, they sit down, they write it, they talk, maybe the director is there or there's the lead writer is the showrunner, but they write the episodes. And then to save money, as soon as they've finished writing all of the episodes and that's done, the majority of them are out of a job.
Right.
They're let go. Now, some of them may be staying on, but not all of them. And so they then are already, while they're writing, they're looking for their next job. Because as soon as that job is up, they're not staying on for a full year. It's only for the sort of the pre-production. And so then they move on to another. So in a year, they might work for 3 different shows, but they're not getting the same on-the-job training. they're not getting the same experience that if you've worked in network TV, say on like one of those primetime shows that runs all year round.
Right, right. Like
Um,
Big Bang Theory or whatever. Yeah.
but something like that where they're on set and then next year they're on set again and next year they're on set again. But they get a couple of years experience. They get a lot of interaction. Then when they go to their next show, they go, right, I have X number of episodes under my belt that I helped in writing. There are X number of episodes that I was the lead writer on that they went, you're assigned to that one, do this. That you got a lot of experience. But now they might work on three different shows in a year and have very little interaction with the actual production process. And so you would look at those two CVs. One person has worked on one show for 3 years, and this other person has been on these 3 different shows. You go, so you look at these two CVs, and you go, well, who has more experience?
Right.
And it is not that either one of these people is a bad writer, but the experience you get is different. And the mentorship that you get is different. And all of that feeds into how you write, how you think about writing, what you do. And so when they move on to their next job, they might end up being one of the senior writers on a show. And they still don't have the same experience of what a producer does, what a cinematographer does, or a locations guy. They don't have that same mix of things. And those are all valuable experiences for any writer because it helps you understand the limits of what your script can do. And it helps you think of the problems that people are going to find on set, where you go, that's a silly thing to put in the script. They're going to have to change that because that's really difficult to do on set. Or so it's changed the experience that writers get. And so we have a new generation of writers who are growing up in a media landscape that has been dominated by franchises from our childhood, from the early 80s onwards, all of the rise of these franchises. And there's a nostalgia factor to that. And so when you're feeling insecure and powerless, one of the things that we turn to is nostalgia, something that is comforting. So we turn to the things from our childhood that are reassuring. And lo and behold, like look at a lot of the media products that are being produced. They are resurrecting a lot of things from the 80s and 90s because they are comforting. There's an element to that is it's safe, it's known. And then it's variations on a theme. It's not having to come up with an entirely new concept that you don't know if there's an audience for yet. And every time I hear people say, oh, well, why don't they just write something new? You go, because the vast majority of times when someone tries something new, we don't support it with our dollars.
Right.
People will hold out for the next Marvel movie or the next DC movie. It's like, what film's coming out? Oh, it's one of the new comic books. Like we don't even know the name of these sometimes. You go, oh, that's coming. I should go and see that. That's in that cinematic universe. Why did everything suddenly become linked franchise universes? Because there's an established fan base. There's an established product that people are going to know, find reassuring, and be confident then in going, well, I like the first iteration of this. I will watch the second. Mm-hmm. So there's familiarity. It is easier to sell to people. So in a financially conservative position where you're worried about the economics of it, you go for something that already has an established brand name, that may have an established audience, or at least works for an audience of a certain type, that they will at least initially buy into it. And you play with that. But the downside is audiences age. And what works for us when we are 8 years old, what makes Transformers and He-Man work for us when we are 8 years old, does not work when we are now adults. Because if you go back and look at G.I. Joe or He-Man or Thundercats or any of those cartoons that used to show like on a Saturday morning, they were advertisements for toys.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all that they were. They were long running toy advertisements. But when we were kids, it was amazing, and we constructed, like, we had the toys and we created these adventures. And then when someone does it now, and they go, but that's not what this story was. You go back and watch them. They're terrible. They're awful. Like, they really are horrendous. But our memories of them have changed what it is. And we have a very similar thing when we think of some of our favorite scenes from, or our favorite lines from books. And people say, this one line gets me every time. And then he looked at her. And you're like, really?
Okay.
And you go, that's the line. It gets you. Oh yeah, like, I'm almost crying thinking about it now. And you're like, outside of its context, it is absolutely meaningless.
Yeah.
But in the moment, with everything that has been built up to that line is the final period on the sentence. It bookends it. It brings it all home. And we can't separate. Go, the line is not that good, but the line works in context. We have the same thing when people talk about the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Like, sometimes, people quote a line from it, go, "Oh, this line is so amazing."
Uh-huh.
And sometimes I look at them and I go, "I know why you think the line is amazing. Don't get me wrong, it's a good line,
Uh-huh.
but the reason it is so powerful is it occurs here in the book. If it had occurred somewhere else, the line loses its resonance."
Right. I actually there was I guess a line that gets brought up a lot from Malazan. It's something from the third book about compassion and being compassionate. And
But compassion?
right. Believe it or not, in Malazan, compassion. Um, and it's something said near the end of the book in a really kind of spoilery moment. I don't want to ruin anyone's first reading of that scene, but
If I
I
just
went
I
and
just say
oh yeah.
I just typed into Google Malazan. I started typing compassion and it autofilled Malazan compassion quote.
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep.
And it brought up the one that I think that you're thinking of.
Right. It's something
Um,
like we betray it every day or something like that,
we
or
humans do not understand
yeah.
compassion. In each moment of our lives, we betray it. We know of its worth. Yet in knowing, we then attach to it a value. We guard the giving of it, believing it must be earned. Compassion is priceless in the truest sense of the word. It must be given freely.
Right. And I think it's, again, like you said, it's a great line. But I think there's something about the context, and I have a video where I talk about this whole scene, and I think kind of in the context of that scene, the character is sort of explaining why he won't explain further why he's doing what he's doing. And that quote is, when I hear it, I think, oh, he's just saying, yeah, I'm not gonna give any more reasons for this. Sorry, you're out of luck.
And the other thing is, we see in that particular moment, there is a cost to compassion.
Right.
That it is not done in a way at a moment of time when it is convenient. It is inconvenient, and it results in a cost, a very high, steep price. And we then see the downside. The book illustrates the downside of this, that it is not always convenient. It doesn't always result in the best for you, that it is not an unmitigated good.
Right.
Um, because life is more complicated than that. A lot of, when people talk about compassion in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, like, I am very glad that people see it. But I think one of the things that people sometimes, it's not that they miss it, but they gloss over in the discussion of it, is that while I think the series does come down on the side that compassion should be extended, that empathy and compassion are aspects of the human condition that we need to be aware of and we need to foster and encourage. But it doesn't say that you must always be compassionate. It's about understanding what compassion actually entails. And sometimes it can be devastating. and sometimes it can be difficult. And there's a sequence in one of the books where an evildoer gets punished quite brutally.
In the
And
fourth book, or are we talking at the end of House of Giants? Or I sorry if that ruins the vagueness you were going for, but
well, but the majority of us, when we read that, we celebrate this barbaric punishment because this person is evil. This person is bad. This person deserves to be punished. And we never stop to think that that punishment does not undo all of the evil that he did.
right. Nor does it undo the sort of willful ignorance of people around him. Yeah.
And well, actually, it's not even the willful ignorance because a lot of them are very aware of
Oh,
what he is
right,
doing, but
right,
the
yeah.
political expedience of
Right,
allowing it
right.
because they thought he was necessary. But we celebrate that barbarism. We revel in it because it makes sense to us. Someone does something bad, we should do something bad to them. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Yeah.
But that's when it is clear cut. We have evidence in the text that this guy was bad and he deserved to be punished. But when you start thinking of the real world and we take that mentality, you go, well, are we sure they did that? Oh, well, he was found guilty.
Right.
In a court of law.
Allegedly, yeah.
He was found guilty in a court of law. And courts are never wrong.
Oh, yeah.
People aren't unjustly incarcerated.
Sure.
DNA evidence doesn't sometimes, several decades later, prove that the person was not involved in it at all.
Right.
Well, and we used to say better 10 guilty men go free than an innocent man be sentenced to jail.
Right.
One of these, the equation about how many guilty people do we think it is okay to be free to avoid imprisoning someone unjustly.
Right.
And it kind of got distilled down to, I think the expression was about 10. Better that 10 guilty people go free so that we err on the side of caution, that we don't incarcerate someone who is innocent. It is better to err on the side of caution. And I think as societies, we've changed to, well, better 10 innocent men go to jail than a guilty person get free.
Right, right. Sort of falling back on paranoia as like or like think about the kids or like, think about or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
We've changed as a society, and compassion and empathy have been are part of moving back to understanding. But that's getting into the questions posed by a series that's asking us to commit to a level of introspection and inspection of the societies that we live in and that we function in, because there are very few things in life that have easy answers, and people promising easy answers for things are generally peddling either lies or a boiled down, distilled, bumper sticker version of a more complex reality. But that's one of the great joys of literature, that life is complicated, so is literature. How we explore these things in books is a way for us to test our own beliefs. We're convinced, I'm absolutely right on this. Then read this thing that challenges it. Right. Well, why would I do that? I'm absolutely right. Because if you are right and you read the thing that challenges it and you go, actually, and having said that, I've tested what I thought and I still come down on the side that I'm right. You've tested your hypothesis against a counter argument.
Right.
Or you can just read things that go, yes, you're right. And never challenge it.
Right. It's campaign research going into any vote. It's always that's always the time that I see this type of reading the most important, probably, but maybe when it happens least. This type of read something that definitely isn't what you would normally read, and some, it's nonfiction, some piece of news media that isn't your normal. Yeah.
but like I've had this. I have a number of friends, obviously, over in the US, and someone say, "Oh, I would never watch anything from that news network. I don't trust anything from that. I only trust this news network." And I went, "You trust a news network? I don't trust any of them." Which is why when a news story comes up, I look at it from multiple sources,
Mhm.
but usually I'll check it against sources from a different country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had suggested this to an American friend of mine, and he looked at me in absolute shock. I went, "That's a big news story where you are." He's like, "Yeah." And I went, "And it's being reported over the world." He's like, "Yeah." I went, "And you don't trust how the mainstream media is reporting it in the US?" He's like, "Yeah." I went, "But you do realize that a lot of the media outlets in other parts of the world have no connection to the US ones
Mm.
and have competing national interests and have a different national culture and different things and different." He said, "Yeah." And I went, "Well, why don't you look at those news stories? Just have a look at those ones because they may have their own spin and bias according to the culture that they're in, but it's going to be different from the
Right.
American. And at least then you're getting, a different version of it. And the broadcast rules in different countries can be stricter or looser than other countries.
Right. Right.
And that's an important aspect as well. That and so being able to take it's why I think literature, studying literature is great training, and you've done this with the study of history, is great training in understanding news media because everything is narrativized.
Oh yeah.
Um, if we describe someone, the I'm trying to think. I want to pick an example that is not referring to anything is specific, but um, if there was a news report and they said, "Oh, the rioters were dispersed by uh, members of the police," and then
Mhm.
another news report reporting on the same incident said the demonstrators were attacked by the police force. Describing the same incident, but two narrativizing it in two very, very different ways.
Sure.
One described them as rioters, so that is framing the subject in a different way, and it described them as the police, or it might have said the police officers,
Right.
and the other described as police force,
Force.
which
And
subtly is going, it's emphasizing violence, and they called them demonstrators, which is non-pejorative. And you go, so it's the same news story, but being told in two different ways. Whereas if you look at some of the international reportage that goes on, they're not allowed to do that. They have to use very neutral language when describing things. It has to be very factually based because they have different regulations that they have to adhere to. And so you contrast both those news stories with, say, some of the international stuff. And from that, you get a better sense not only of the particular bias that a singular reporter might have or a news outlet, but you understand how narrative and language are being used to frame facts in a very particular light. And it's part of how propaganda works. It's part of how disinformation campaigns work.
mhm.
There are all of these, and reading, understanding how literature functions. Like, why study literature? Because it it's the basis of how we get news now. We're told stories. And if you understand how stories function, you can read between the lines and the subtext in news stories. It's an incredibly useful skill. Um, that you understand when people are parroting back what they have heard quite often. And this was something I think we discussed before we started recording.
Mhm.
Um, we both have experienced times when we've been in a class learning something. We're sitting there. We have paid to be there. This is something we have chosen to study. We are interested.
We care about it.
And the lecturer has said something, and we've written down our note. And later on, the lecturer asks a question, and so what is that? And you basically repeat back what they had said, and they go, "What? I didn't say that. That's the exact opposite of what I said."
Right.
No, but you said no. I said, and they will repeat it, and you go, "It's not what I just said." No, No, it's not. And that's something that we're paying attention to. But we have listened to those words. We have interpreted what they mean. And that is what we have remembered and written down. We haven't necessarily written down what they said verbatim, because meaning is constructed by the narrative, by the person being narrated to, by the learner, by the reader, by the viewer. We are the ones that construct meaning, and we can make mistakes. We can impose our meaning on something, which alters the meaning of what is being said. Whether you describe someone as a terrorist or a freedom fighter, you're making a judgment. Whether they are an insurrectionist or a patriot, whether they are a hero or a villain, can be shaped by point of view. And if you are unaware of how we are being sold that story, it is very easy to get caught up in the rhetoric of it and end up repeating it without any understanding of it. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about understanding how narrative is constructed, not just in books, but in film and in television and in anything that we consume, that we are surrounded by story.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a lot of interesting stuff to think on. I'm trying to pick a piece of it to follow up on. I guess maybe so I started reading this edited collection of it's called Narrative Theory Unbound, Queer and Feminist Interventions. And while a lot of it is narrative theory, there's obviously from that subtitle, there's some feminist and queer theory in there as well. One of the essays that I recently read, it was here, actually, let me I don't want to bring it up without saying the author's name, or without citing my sources. It is called Meta-Narration and the Structure of Address, and this is written by Robin Warhol. And she's talking about characters in a show like The Office, narrating their experiences and explaining what's happening to the camera in that show versus the characters on a show like Real Housewives, and kind of comparing and contrasting how, or showing, I guess the argument is that the characters in The Office appear much more realistic because the narratives and the way that they're more directly addressing the camera reflects what we think of, what the audience thinks of as reality much more closely than what the women on Real Housewives are talking about. And of course, because of the subtitle of this book, there's a lot of there's stuff about how like women in Real Housewives are depicted as sort of villainous almost, and they're these mean, money hungry, like reliant, like not self-sufficient characters in their own stories. But we don't necessarily need to get into the feminist theory conversation, but I was just curious if you had any kind of thoughts on that juxtaposition that the author's, I guess, going for in that.
I haven't read that essay, but that article sounds fascinating though, and I just from your summary of it, I think it goes to about expectations of genre. The Real Housewives of America. Who is the audience for that? Is the audience for that the same as the audience for The Office? And you go, so okay, there might be a different demographic breakdown. Right. And then you think, in terms of genre, The Office was an understated sort of drab comedy. It was playing on the everyday, the everyman, about people who are underachievers, and the norm. But Real Housewives plays into melodrama. It plays into soap opera. Everything is exaggerated because it's all high stakes. It's all heightened emotion because it's playing into that Schadenfreude and the excitement we get from like a truly villainous character. And but that's an entirely different genre of storytelling, because let's face it, everyone knows that The Real Housewives and The Office are both scripted shows.
Right.
Like, they are both they are not. Neither one of them is a documentary. And even that, like, we could get into talking about documentary and how documentary quite often is very misleading.
Right.
Um,
Even the Writers Guild of America, when they do their awards and nominations, there's a category for documentary script. So and of course that people might at first think of something like that as like, oh, they're talking about just whatever the narrator is saying. But then in saying that, there's a narrator is saying something. So
well, the Michael Moore did an award-winning documentary, Bowling for Columbine.
yeah, uh-huh. Oh yeah.
And I think in that there's, I think, is it Charlton Heston? He goes to Charlton Heston's house.
Yes. It's been a
Very
while.
interesting.
I remember
There's
this.
this whole,
Sorry.
but it is Charlton Heston's house, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
But there's a shot where he goes up to the door and knocks on it, and then the camera shows from the inside the house the door opening, and you go, how did they get the camera in the house if that's when the door opened?
Right.
Like, it's not Michael Moore doesn't have a magical camera. He has a camera crew. So they went up, they'd organized it. We're going to go up and we'll take the shot of him knocking on the door. And then we're going to set up inside. And now you're going to go up to the door and open.
Mhm.
Or, you know, whatever way they do that. And I honestly, it's been so long since I've seen it. But when you're watching a documentary, always remember that documentaries are often shot that they're meant to feel very personal, that there is no camera crew. And you go, there's a cameraman or a camera person and a lighting person and the sound person. You know, there's a crew there. But part of what you do with a lot of these documentaries is you hide that you make it feel personal. If that's the type of documentary you're doing. And so it feels very intimate. But you go, so that shot where it's showing the interviewer and it's showing them from one side and they're talking, and then it cuts to the person responding. You go, either they have two cameras, one aimed at one person, one aimed at the other, or they filmed it all from one side and then they refilmed it from the other side. It's one of those two things, because there's no way that one camera could catch both those angles. The camera had to have been moved. And so it's not like what we're doing, right, where people can see the entire exchange. The documentary has been curated, it has been edited, it has been compiled, and it is used to narrativize something, to provide a streamlined movement through a topic. Like when you write an essay, you flow through the points in your essay to lead to a conclusion. That's what documentaries do. That's a form of rhetoric, which is obviously tied into narrative. Right. Narrative and rhetoric are not wholly separate subjects. They are interlinked. And so we see how a lot of these things tie in together.
Yeah, and I mean, just to back up a little with the two cameras thing, Warhol, she points that out in how, and I haven't watched enough of the Real Housewives of whatever city they're in, and I haven't watched it enough to notice it, but Warhol makes it a point to talk about how they're always talking to some imagined or maybe very real interviewer off camera slightly. Right, exactly.
And then they totally did that, and I can't believe it.
Exactly, right. Whereas in The Office, there's like so I guess with Real Housewives, they're pretending that the camera crew is just a fly on the wall and they're not there at all, even though they are. But in The Office, because it's sort of mocking the documentary style, it's able to kind of, I don't know if bridge that gap between I don't want to use the words wrong, but like the diegetic is what's happening in the story, correct? And mimetic is the real world, right? Or
mimesis is the creation of a sort of real feeling. Okay, verisimilitudinous reality within the diegesis. So the diegesis refers to the constructed narrative.
Okay. Okay. So then I guess that makes sense, because then what she's saying is that in The Office, there's much more successful at conveying that mimesis by the character's looks at the camera. Even though those looks are part of the script, like everything's still part of the story. Everything's still structured to make it feel realistic.
Yeah.
But with Real Housewives, there's no effort at all to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Catherine Hume has a book. I think it's Fantasy and Mimesis.
Okay.
So the fantastic is that there's no way you're connecting it to our world. But mimesis, so if you think of what people call realist fiction or realistic fiction, what we're actually talking about is the creation of a verisimilitudinous reality uh, within the diegesis,
Okay.
and it resembles a perception of our reality, but it's not real. Like the London in a book that is set in London is not London.
Right.
It's not even an accurate reflection of London. It is an attempt to create a vision of a version of London that the reader can recognize as London. So it is mimicking, and a friend of mine gets annoyed when I sort of use mimicking to describe mimesis because they're not the same. But it's easier to explain to people who haven't studied it. It's mimicking London. So it is a recreation of a version of London, but it is clearly not London.
Yeah.
But we recognize that. So when we read Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist,
Mm-hmm.
and you read Oliver Twist, does that London exist?
In the
No.
book. Yeah.
Like it exists in the book, but it doesn't actually exist. You can't go visit it.
Right.
Did it ever exist? No, that version of London never actually existed. Some bits of it are recognizable. Some bits of it are reminiscent of. Some bits of it you go, oh, he wrote about that street. When I was at university, there was a popular TV show was filmed in that area, and every once in a while, like an episode would come on, and you'd be watching it, and you go, that's the house that's the house that I used to have a room in, just there. And you see the car driving along, and then the next shot, they turn left, and you go, there's no left turn there. That's not even the same street. That's halfway across the city. And they walk into this doorway, and you go, I know where that doorway is. It's 200 feet up the road there. And they walk in, and it opens up, and you go, but that hallway is 2 miles over that way in a different building. So it looks real. It looks like the real place. It creates this impression of the real place, but it is a fictional reality that mimics. It convinces the reader that it kind of feels real, but it is not real. And that's why there's difficulty sometimes when we use terms like realist or realistic, because again, those two things mean different things. Realist is not the same as realistic. And a lot of them get used interchangeably. And in informal discourse, that happens all the time. But when we start using it as a yardstick for critical discourse, that's where nuance and having specificity in terminology is actually really, really useful, because it stops you making a lot of these base assumptions.
Right.
Because you have to be more specific in your language. You have to be clearer with your language. And having to be clear with your language means that you actually have to be clear with your thought. And it's this feedback loop of, like, if you think in 1984, why do we talk about things in all of the different words for good? 1984 they had good, plus good, double plus good. You don't need any more. Like that covers everything. But there's a whole range, fantastic, wonderful, awesome. Like even just with those, while they all mean good to a certain extent, the connotations, what is associated with those terms, gives you a different picture. Something that is awesome and something that is fantastic. You can use those two words to both mean, oh, it was great. But awesome because it inspired awe. Fantastic because it was leaning into these fantastical elements that took you somewhere different. Suddenly you start seeing the wordplay that you can do. And when we see authors utilize that, and in a paragraph, very simple description that is trying to build toward tension and violence that's going to erupt, and you notice that they've started seeding in violent words, the clash of or the startled bird's wings, blah blah blah, and the silence was shattered and the sharp noises of, and so you see these words that are violent or have hard edges to them that are seeded all the way down through, and they could be replaced by any number of different words. But because they chose that lexicon, because they were selecting from a certain type of word, that when you get to the violence suddenly breaking out, it feels like it fits. Whereas if a lot of the words had been softer, then it would have been, well, where did the violence come from? That just leapt out of nowhere. But it's ways of subtly shading and influencing the reader, preparing them for something happening. So it's not just when people talk about breadcrumbs in a text or foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is usually used to describe plot elements that little tiny references to are made early on. Mm-hmm. And so when the event happens, it's, oh, I should have seen that coming because, there are other ways to do, but there are other ways to do foreshadowing, because you can foreshadow tone and style shift. You can build up a tension with these things. You can build up an atmosphere with these things that fit with what is suddenly going to happen. Unless, of course, you want that suddenly, what the hell feeling of, I thought everything was fine, and then this thing happened out of nowhere. Like an author might want that. And so they deliberately choose words that don't give the game away, that don't build towards it, that lull you. And that's understanding how a story is told. That's your text-specific, close reading stuff that my teacher, Mrs. Duffy, emphasized so heavily.
Uh-huh.
And yet, if you're watching a Marvel movie, you might go, oh, I really need to go to the toilet. In fact, if I hold on 5 minutes, there's going to be a big fight sequence.
Yeah.
How do you know there's going to be a big fight sequence in 5 minutes' time? You go, it's a Marvel movie. There's a pattern.
Right. There hasn't been one for 20 minutes, and we just met.
Look, there it's just started. I'll go to the bathroom because they're going to be fighting for at least 5 minutes. You know, right. Because it's written to a pattern. And you go, and that's the opposite of close read. That's understanding the patterns and structures inherent in the text. When people talk about Save the Cat, you go, for a start, Save the Cat is a very popular thing in Hollywood for the structure of how to write a successful Hollywood movie. And it's heavily based on Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Very heavily based. But it's been boiled down into how many pages of your screenplay. And then you need this thing. And this thing has to last for a certain number of pages. It has to fall within this number of minutes, and each page is timed out at. And they've worked it all out. And it's a really good, straightforward formula to work for a structure. And you see it in lots of different things. Or you can take something like Star Wars. Very famously, people have used Star Wars as a way to illustrate the hero with a thousand faces and the hero's journey, because Lucas read Campbell and went, that's a great idea. And he looked at that structure and went, okay, I'm going to play with this. I'm going to use it as a way to give the story I want a skeleton to hold it together. But what Campbell was doing, what narratologists have done for a long time, is they look at texts to find the structure. They don't use the structure to write the text. It is descriptive, not prescriptive. And understanding how these structures function. Freytag's pyramid, very famous one. Introduction, instigating event, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. There you go. Everyone knows it. I think it's taught in high school. Yeah. And you go, right, that's 19th century German literature. Particular type of German. That's where it came from. But it's a really stable structure. It makes sense. There's a nice flow of logic to it. And it's adaptable. And when you think about it, a 3-act play can fit quite nicely with that. The first act being introduction, ending with the instigating event. Where's it going to go? Second act, your rising action, building towards the climax. The third act, the climax, and then the aftermath. There you go. I've used 3-act structure, different narrative structure with Freytag's pyramid. Oh, but what if I wanted to do something a bit different in the middle? You go, instigating action, that's what they go off on. And you can have rising action, and they have a new event, and then the hero can fail. And we see the aftermath of that failure. And then there's a new event, and this time they succeed. And then we see the aftermath. You build in mini Freytag's pyramids all the way along. So now you have I heard you like Freytag's pyramid, so I put a Freytag's pyramid in your Freytag's pyramid. Or you can go to the mystery genre or police procedurals. And sometimes the instigating event happens before the introduction because we see the murder at the start and then the police get called in. Oh, but what about a serial narrative where every week you go, well, you can't then have constantly the world changing. It has to be reset at the end because you don't want too much change over the course of the season. So you use a different structure. Oh, what if you are working with ad breaks on network TV and it's a 30-minute show and you're going to have 2 ad breaks? Oh, well, if it's 2 ad breaks, 3-act structure works really well. Yeah. There's going to be 5 ad breaks. 5-act structure will work even better. And you think of how you break it down. Oh, before the ad, I want something that will be a hook to get the viewer to come back after the ads. So I might structure my narrative differently if I know where the ad break's going to be. Oh, but we're going to put this on streaming and it's going to be released all in one go. Well, in that case, I don't have to worry about where the ad breaks are going to be. There aren't going to be. So I can use a different structure in it. And I don't necessarily always have to have a hook at the end, as long as I have a hook somewhere and they want to see where it goes. And if it's all being released at once, they can binge watch it. And I'm going to do a full season arc rather than individual episode arcs. Or I might want to use individual episode arcs that build into a season arc. Or one plot thread that runs through all the different episodes is going to be the season arc. But each episode is going to have a main arc and a secondary arc that are episode specific. And suddenly, it's not that there's one narrative structure. It's not that there's one way to do something. It's understanding why the narrative structures function the way they do, what effects they are describing, how those effects are created. And that's what a lot of structuralism, or at least narratology, looks at a lot of these things. But structuralism does it as well. There are different aspects of structuralism. There are different ways of distilling the sort of generalized, abstract notions about texts and how they work. And it ties into reader response theory. It ties into these other things as well. Different ways of measuring our expectations. If you think of a comedy, a traditional theater comedy, like drama comedy, hero starts in one position. Life basically goes horribly, horribly wrong. And then suddenly it all gets better.
Uh-huh.
And it ends up being a smoothed out tick.
Sure.
Tragedy, usually hero starts here and then everything is going really well and things are getting really, and then it all goes horribly wrong. That's tragedy. And then you can impose a 3-act structure on it, you can impose a 5-act structure on it, but you still get that general movement. 7-act structure. Oh, well, what if I want to move? What if I do a flashback? What if I put my introduction part after the first sequence? Like Iron Man. Iron Man doesn't start at the beginning. Iron Man starts partway through to show what the instigating action is, then jumps back in time to give you the introduction.
Right.
But
it works.
But really no one goes, oh, it has to be done a certain way. There are different ways of doing it. It's understanding how they work. It's not about slavishly following a formula. It is never about people can, and there's a lot of derivative works out there. There are a lot of people who produce stuff to a formula, who produce that they just churn out book after book, story after story, film after film that uses the same formula. And all they're doing is subtly changing the surface details.
The main character is a little shorter and a different haircut the next time. Yeah.
Oh, this is a totally different superhero film because this person has different superpowers.
Right. Even though it's still lasers and yeah.
Did it start out where they were having a normal day and then something went horribly wrong and then they had to fight someone and save a little old lady or save someone? Yes. And then after that, did it sort of flash back in time to show you a more human side to them and slow down for it? Yes. And then did it show where the main antagonist is coming from and what the major... Well, yes. And then did it switch it? You go, yeah, it's the same pattern. It doesn't matter that the superpowers are different or that it's not a little old lady they're saving this time. It was a little kid. Or a cat.
Yeah.
Save the cat. Oh, right. But the reason it got that name is if you take your protagonist and at the beginning have them go out of their way to do something heroic and ignore authority at the same time to show that they're being their own man. It's, you can't run in there, you'll die. Oh, get rid of those regulations. I'm not going to listen to that. There's people in danger. I'm going to rescue them.
I'm too important.
And they run in and they save the person. And when, if I'd listened to you, this person would have died. And we're like, yeah, stick it to the man. You do the right thing. And oh, they're a hero. And we're on their side. So in the next scene, it can show that they're a hard drinking alcoholic who's a ruined personal life. And we go, yeah, but they run into a burning building to save someone.
Right.
We're already on their side. That's why this thing works so well. You get the audience on side by showing them do something heroic, do something good at the beginning. Ignore doing what they're told to do, instead doing the right thing and being shown to be right. And that puts us on their side. That's the effect.
So you saying that kind of makes me, I don't know, it makes me think about something. I don't know if irony is the word I want to use here, but going back to Iron Man, being the film that launched the MCU and all of these fairly formulaic superhero movies, I'd say there's not, I'd say Iron Man itself actually takes a lot of risks, and deviating from regular or from the typical structures, because like the first thing that we see of him before we see him being an alcoholic, we see him talking about weapons of mass destruction, and we see, or is that right at the beginning, or he does that and then they're in the car and then the car blows up, and so we kind of feel bad for him because we know he's going to get hurt, but we don't feel particularly like he's undeserving of his come up, or like, you know, we don't. So I think it's interesting that that movie started the MCU, but now so many of their projects are very
well. Technically, the Hulk movie with Edward Norton was the first,
right.
And then there was kind of a soft reboot kind of thing, and they went right. But if you think of that, so at the beginning, he's fast talking, he's cool, he's suave, he's sophisticated. It's patriotic. He's going to defeat those bad guys.
Yeah.
He's fighting for America. Like all of the things that we want. And then he's in the car and he's fun and he's joking with these people.
Right.
And he makes a quip and it's like, no gang signs. Oh no, I'm only joking, you know. And he's sitting there having a drink. And then something unexpected happens and he's injured and we're like, oh. And then we see actually, like if you think of Tony Stark in that film, he's a horrible person.
Oh yeah.
He's a really bad person. Yeah. He is an egocentric, selfish, self-centered, womanizing, uncaring, ignorant, purveyor of weapons that even a child could go, you're making weapons that are going to kill people. Right. But he is willfully ignorant of that. He treats women badly. He treats his employees badly. He doesn't care about anyone apart from himself. He is a spoiled brat. And yet, he's a genius. But he's an asshole.
Yeah.
And there's almost nothing about him that is likable. Well, apart from he's quick-witted and he has these snappy comebacks to things. Right. And he's going on. He meets this reporter who's really antagonistic, this good-looking reporter, and then talks her into bed. And he drives a fast car. And you go, it's the whole fantasy of being the powerful, brilliant man. Right. That's what Tony Stark is. But in all honesty, he's a shitty human being. Yeah. He has no redeeming qualities. He has this genius brain. He can invent anything. And the arc reactor that his father designed, that they've had forever, it's like, it takes until what, Iron Man 3 before they go, you know what, I could probably use this to create clean energy for the world.
Right.
But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to continue to make miniature versions that are going to power my armor suits that I can go and shoot things. Right.
I mean, even the end of the first movie, it's him saying he's Iron Man. It's an ego trip. Like, it's not this great, oh wow, like,
and you know, it's done. And when we think about it, like, he really is. He is not a good human being. He's not a nice human being. And even when he makes the realization, I saw that our weapons were being used by bad guys. You're like, but you're okay with your weapons being used by the people you legitimately sell it to, because you know they're still being used to kill people. Do you think that the world is a simple binary of good guy and bad guy?
Right.
That people wake up, oh, I'm on the bad guy team today. He is such he doesn't consider any of it, but he decides he's going to shut down, this aspect of Stark Industries, and then just creates more weapons.
Right.
Like the helicarriers for Shield.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, your turbines weren't great, so I've helped you design the whole thing of Captain America, the Winter Soldier, the new automated helicarriers that can wipe out the world. Tony
Right.
Stark basically built for them.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, you're done designing weapons, are you, Tony? What? Oh, that thing that you've designed that's a weapon. No, you're still designing weapons. You just decide now that you want to use them. You don't trust anyone else to use them.
Yeah.
Like his claim, like in Iron Man 2, I've privatized world peace. Yeah, because corporations are definitely who we want to trust with world peace.
Right. Right.
And that's what a whole load of this is about. It's understanding what is the assumed norm? What is the narrative position a narrative is taking? What is it supporting? What is it glossing over? What is it saying is okay behavior? What is it saying is not okay behavior? What is it not even acknowledging exists? What is it concentrating on? All of these are different aspects. No film can cover every single thing. But when we look at, say, the MCU as a whole, for the most part, it pretty much ignored LGBTQ people.
Literally just last night I asked my fiance, I said, are there any LGBTQ characters in the MCU? And we were like, huh, I don't think so. I mean, I even right now I'm
Well,
struggling to
in
think
the recent Black Panther movie, I think
okay.
there's one line.
Okay.
But that's the thing. It's for the most part, it's as if gay people and non-cis people they don't exist
Right.
in this representation of the world. And you're like, that seems a bit odd. I'm fairly sure that LGBTQ people have existed since at least the Babylonian times.
Right. Right.
Um, and so that aspect of society is not being represented. And the thing, people might say, well, I don't have a problem. They don't have to represent all aspects of society. Well, okay, fine. But it's something to note. They aren't being shown.
Right.
And
Especially
then,
when it's celebrated for representing diversity in other ways. That almost raises the question of, oh, okay, so is there a strategy behind like which films and when they talk about these things? Like what's the political, like what's going on that made, I don't know. Yeah.
and even when we think of the inclusion of people of color,
Mhm.
well, okay, let's take the Iron Man movies. Oh, Rhodey. Rhodey is played by an actor of color. Great.
Mhm.
So in the first one, he's the killjoy. He's the friend. And at the end, he looks at the suit of armor and goes, next time. Because next time he's going to get the suit of armor. But in the first one, he doesn't, because it's Iron Man. It's all about Iron Man.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, there is a person of color who is a supporting actor. So in the next one, Don Cheadle gets recast as
Right.
Rhodey, but he gets the War Machine. But at the end, who gets the girl?
Right. Right.
It's still Tony's story, and War Machine is again the sidekick, the side character, the comic relief, because the hammer weapons don't work properly.
Right.
The hammer tech weapons don't work. Like, and if he only had stuck with his friend Tony would have done things better for him. That he's a sidekick. He's not the leading character. He's not the focus. Again, Tony is. When we look at the third one, again, Rhodey's in it, but Rhodey gets captured and Rhodey's suit gets it. And then at the end, he's sitting watching what happens. And then he gets to do a little bit, and
Right.
he gets in the suit and takes the president away. And Tony defeats the bad guy. And you go, yeah, again, it's focused on that. It's focused on that aspect. Does that mean that it is a racist narrative? No, but you have to admit it's focused on those things. It's not really promoting a lot of diversity, because it's still focused on a white man as the main white cis heteronormative story. When we look at the inclusion of Scarlett Johansson as Natasha Romanoff, in Iron Man 2 is when she comes into it,
right,
and how she's framed when Tony's interviewing her, and it's all about basically just checking her out.
Yeah.
And it is such a sleazy scene, Nolly, when you're watching it. And then at the end, we see that actually, no, she wasn't just an assistant. She was Black Widow all along, and she does all these cool things. But again, like, she's wearing the thing and it's unzipped down, and it's all to
Right.
make her look sexy. And there are all these shots that we see of her bum. You don't get those shots of Tony's bum.
Right.
There are not a lot of shots looking down Tony's chest and looking at his ass all the time.
Right.
But when Scarlett Johansson is in frame, quite often we see her bum and we see her chest being focused on, because she's a sexy woman, and the camera is almost like the camera is there for a male viewer to go, oh, look at the sexy woman.
And
And
like
that's
there's the whole problem of using what should be just normal, Scarlett Johansson being a superhero, in whatever story, but using that as a twist, like, oh, I bet you didn't see this coming, like she's actually gonna kick ass, like just using that sort of thing, those, I don't know, using
no,
inclusions of stuff like that as a twist is problematic. Yeah.
but in the Avengers, they actually do it really, really well, because she's playing the beautiful, helpless woman in that reverse interrogation scene at the beginning. And that's a really good sequence showing how that's the expectation, and she plays on that assumption,
Right.
and that's then emphasizing her agency. And she does the same thing again with Loki, because like she bursts into tears and she's all fragile, and Loki assumes that he's superior, and she says, "Oh, it's that thing," and immediately goes off. But that's very aware writing, and it plays into that male gaze assumption. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that the writer and director involved in this is. There are other conversations that can be had about that,
Right.
but talking specifically about that aspect, there's a reason for it. But when we look at that team, Bruce Banner, Tony Stark, Thor, Hawkeye,
Steve Rogers.
Captain America, so and then Natasha Romanoff. Slight disparity in numbers here.
Oh yeah.
Now, if we did a film that had 5 female heroes and 1 male hero, how do you think that would be received by a lot of the internet at the minute?
Yeah. They would. Oh, they would call it all woke or whatever, or, as if it's a bad word.
but this was interesting when Netflix did Daredevil, the TV show. I thought it was brilliant, taking superheroes down to street level, the nitty gritty, showing Daredevil actually getting beat. And it was actually started by the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie. For all of the faults that people had with it, it showed the physical damage that he was taking.
Right.
And it made it a lot. He wasn't Superman, who was invulnerable to damage. He wasn't Wolverine, who could just heal. He had a human body, and although it had accelerated healing, like, he was covered in bruises. That was what they really focused on in the Netflix show. They showed the human cost, both physical, emotional, and in terms of his relationships. And that was an absolutely fascinating show. And then I remember when they had Jessica Jones launched, and in the very first episode, I remember thinking, there's a lot of women in this.
Yeah.
And then I went to IMDb and I counted up the number of female actors, the number of male actors, and went, you know what? It's actually close to 50-50. There aren't a lot of women.
Oh.
But there are a lot of women in comparison to what I was used to.
Okay.
And from that point, I didn't notice it from that point on. I mean, I think Jessica Jones, the first season of Jessica Jones, is absolutely brilliant TV.
Perfect.
Quite harrowing,
Yeah.
but brilliant TV. But this was something that Gina Davis has been speaking about quite a lot, where because so much of our media is male dominated, unconsciously, we associate that as a norm. where the majority of, even in the background, as you said, it was they sampled all of these movies and TV shows, and the background characters was over 70%. I think it was over 70% male. So there was a street shot, and it was showing all of these people milling around in a street, and when you counted them, it was mostly men.
Oh,
When there was someone had one line, it was like an ER doctor, and they went, "Oh, well, we need an ER doctor," and it was always cast as a man. You go, but why not cast a woman? Like ER, there are female ER doctors. But if there was a nurse, nurse female. If there was a doctor, doctor male. And all of these little things work their way into narrative until we just assumed that is normal, because that's what we see in film. That's what we see in television. We see it again and again and again until we assume that's what's normal. And yet, when we think about it, you go, nah, I've been to a hospital. There are male doctors, female doctors. There's male nurses, there's female nurses. Like, it's
right.
There's a mixture. But that was so rarely what we saw on TV. And so what Gina Davis was saying was, just aim to be more inclusive. Like, have 50% of your background characters played by female actors. Couple of the bit roles that you have, that's one line or two lines. If it's a pilot, the pilot can be a woman. There are female pilots. Like, it doesn't have to be a man. You can have a woman be a pilot. And suddenly, just doing that normalized the fact that we live in a society that is more diverse than just white men everywhere.
Right. Who would have thought?
But that's the thing. It's so when people talk about a lot of the diversity in film and television, like these are very simple things that at the script stage, switching a male character to be played by a female actor or a non-binary actor, like most of the time, audiences won't know who it was written for in the first place. And so it doesn't make a difference. I think people get bent out of shape sometimes when there's a character that they like and it has been recast, not how they imagined.
Right.
And you go, well, I can understand you not liking it, but that's not the same as being disrespectful to the source material. Like when they cast Christopher Reeve as Superman, that's not what Superman looked like. But that's what Superman came to look like because of Christopher Reeve. And then when they cast Brandon Routh, that's what Superman looked like. And then when they cast Henry Cavill, or when Tom Welling played him on Smallville, all of them looked slightly different. What does Batman look like?
Yeah.
Adam West, Michael Keaton, Val Kilmer,
right.
George Clooney,
right.
James Patterson. They're inconsistent in terms of height and in their eye color, their hair color, because that's not important to Batman. What does James Bond look like?
Right. What does Dr.
We've had so many different representations of James Bond, and not only that, but in terms of character, James Bond has changed radically in certain respects over the years.
Oh, I can't stand the Roger Moore movies. I'm sorry if you're good of that particular era,
but people go, oh no, but they're being true to the. When has James Bond ever been true to the source material?
Right.
There are so many things in the source material that you'd look at now and go, I wouldn't want to be putting that on screen.
Right.
You change things to match the sensibilities of the audience that you're trying to sell it to. And that can be difficult for us when we are not that audience. If suddenly it's being marketed to an audience that we're not part of, and you go, but why are they changing it? I wanted it the original one. You go, but there's a big market demographic there. We mightn't be part of it anymore. We might have aged out of it. We might not be who they're aiming this narrative at. And you know what? It's just unfortunate. Not all narratives are for us. Right. But, and again, it's not that this is a new thing. Hollywood is not doing anything now that it didn't do before. except being more open and honest about it and trying to correct some of its previous
Yeah.
mistakes. But Hollywood has always been concerned about making money.
Mhm.
Directors or writers might talk about things as being a passion project, but studios produce things that make money. And that's the thing. There's a balance in narrative, whether we're talking about books or films or television. There's a balance between art and the commodified product, and it falls somewhere on that one. Is it true to the author's artistic vision? Yes. And it's absolutely unreadable apart from those 5 people over there who loved it.
Uh-huh.
Is it true to the author's artistic vision? No, but it appeals to hundreds of thousands of people and contains elements of what the author wanted. There's a balance. Not all books, not all stories have to be for everyone. But again, not all stories are only for a few. That art can be enjoyed by lots of different people. And one of the great things about working with authors is helping them polish their vision to the best that I can so that they can tell the best version of the story that they're putting down on paper. It's not about, I'm going to guarantee you an audience. You go, I can't do that. No one can do that. I can tell you what a lot of the current trends are. I can tell you things that people find popular. But if you are writing to that, you're writing to the product. You're not writing to the story. And that's fair enough. Like, people have to make a living. You know, artists don't starve in a garret anymore. That's a weird vision of, you know, oh, they should suffer for their art. No, artists should live comfortably.
Right.
We enjoy the things that they produce, but we have to be aware of the fact that we live in a society where markets dominate everything. The number of publishers has shrunk.
Mhm.
At times of economic stress, one of the first things to disappear is spending money for luxuries like books. Books, even as a hobby. Loads of people are reading. It's great that we have ebooks and we have audiobooks because it makes things accessible because, you know, people spend more time commuting now. But, you know, we are reading in a marketplace that has a lot of competing distractions. Computer games, films, television, YouTube, streaming services, the radio. Oh, I remember the days when we all listened to radio plays on the wireless. You know, oh, the decline of radio plays, it's a crying shame. You know,
You hear that every day.
but that's the thing. Tastes change, things change, demographics change. Self-publishing has been great in a lot of respects. But again, like all of these things, trying to find the books that you want becomes more difficult because it used to be you could walk into a bookstore and there was a whole range of things. But bookstores, because of Amazon, now have less in them in terms of variety because there are certain market leaders they want to put there because they're the ones that sell, that keep the bookstore open. And they're less willing to take a chance on an unknown book.
The nearest bookstore I live to, or I live close to. I don't want to like call out a specific store or staff or anything, but I noticed a few months ago I went in there and they had separated the books by not only genre, and sometimes the way that they separate things by genre is a little bit of a head scratcher, but they put all of the hardcovers in kind of one shelving unit or a couple shelving units up front. And then it went to trade paperbacks. And then you had to snake your way all the way to the back to get to the mass market paperbacks, which and they don't have many of those. And it's a shame for us. Like, I mean, I'm sure you're aware a lot of older fantasy stuff is on mass market paperback, and that's like I love that stuff. I love walking into old used bookstores and seeing all that stuff, but with the more popular stores and going in and thinking, okay, I have to look in 3 different spots for a book I'm looking for. They're probably not going to have it anyway. And I guess they're putting the hardcovers up front because they're more expensive and because they look a little bit nicer and all
But
that.
also, hardcovers are usually the recently released books because it's,
Right, right.
again, a sped up selling cycle. If you think of the number of authors now, there, you used to have like your headline authors, then you had your mid list, and then a lot of debut authors. But an author used to be able to make a living by, your book came out and let's say it did well, and then your next book came out and it did even better because you've established a bit of a following and a fan base, and
Right.
you carry on doing that. But over the years, you then developed a backlist, a back catalog of works that were constantly being bought. That actually, after the initial sort of furor or the excitement over a new book being released, you could live comfortably for the next year and a half while you're working on your next project on the royalties from your back catalog from the previous books, because they're constantly being sold and being kept in bookstores and people picking them up. And now we have a much more disposable attitude toward books, where it's, this is the latest thing, and you'll see that there'll be a buzz of this book has come out, and suddenly on you'll see all the tweets about it, you'll see all of the reviews about it, people will be talking about it, they'll be doing a read along about it, and then it'll disappear,
Right.
and you'll never hear of it again,
Right.
because everyone's moved on to the next one.
Yeah.
And it's part of this cycle. It's we constantly move on to the new and improved. What's the latest thing? And part of that is like we encourage. Think of how many people talk about how many books they've read in a year. And don't get me wrong, I love the fact that people are reading. It makes me glad to hear, I've read 50 books this year, I've read 100 books this year.
Right.
But people focus a lot on the numbers.
Right.
And I think if that is what you're aiming for, sometimes that's missing the point of reading.
Right.
At least to me.
If it's about satisfying a Goodreads goal, then I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's for the right reasons.
But the thing is, people can use all different sorts of things to motivate them. I have a goal. I want to keep reading, and having a goal helps. And I'm going to aim at 1 book a week or 2 books a week. And you go, great. I'm so glad that you have the time in your life to read 2 or 3 books a week. I don't. I have other time commitments. And I'm okay with that. I have other time commitments. There are things that I have to devote my time to, and I don't have the time sometimes to read. And it's a shame, but I've made that choice. And the other thing is, there are sometimes when people go, I was listening to it on audio, and I listened to it at 2 times speed so I can get through more books. Yeah, well, that's great. And it's a skill. It's one that I have not developed to the same extent. I have listened to audiobooks. There are quite a few that I enjoy, but I don't know those books as well as the books that I have physically read. The books that I've physically read, I retain a lot more of the information. I understand a lot more about them. Whereas the books that I have listened to, quite often I can give you a synopsis of what happened in them. But I wouldn't be able to talk about them in the same way that I talk about books that I've physically read. It's a different experience for me. And getting through a book, I never think of it that way. Getting through a book. It's not a chore. It's getting to read a book.
Right.
Oh, I love to get to read.
I think the only times that I might think of it in that way is if I've agreed in some kind of book club scenario to read something. And if there are other things I'm reading that it's like, oh yes, I really enjoy reading this one, and then it's like, oh, I should probably get through that one before I get back to this one. I think that's probably when I would use that language. Yeah.
And it's all part of people who, can listen at that speed and they get enjoyment out of the read. But if it ever turns into, well, I'm listening at that speed because I need to get through it because I have this goal, well, why are you reading it then?
Right.
What's the point?
Right.
If all it is a number on a spreadsheet to tick off, I've read this and that's it. You're better off going, I just reduced my target for the year and not read it.
Yeah.
Because I think that that isn't enjoying books. That isn't appreciating the time and the effort and the expertise that an author's put in. It's not immersing yourself in the story. It's putting it on as a distraction while you're doing chores.
Or especially with audiobooks, sometimes I think about the listening on the faster speeds and stuff. I'm sure the narrators chose to read the book at the pace that they did for a reason. And I get that sometimes people want I are eager and excited to see what happens and want to go through an audiobook similar speed to like when if they're like physically reading it. But sometimes I think, oh, I wonder if that pause that the whoever's narrating this, whatever pause they put in there, they might have done that for a certain reason. Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, the number of times where like a line is on its own in between two paragraphs because the author is emphasizing this line. It's a big, and so you'll find there's a pause at the end of that the paragraph that precedes it. Then there's a line. Then there's another pause, and then there's the next line.
Mm-hmm.
But the faster you speed up the narration, a half-second pause and a 2.5-second pause and a 0.125-second pause.
Yeah.
Like, trying to discern the difference in those pause lengths. That's hard to do.
Yeah.
When someone's going through it. So I think you can lose some of the emphasis. You can lose the emphasis that is being placed on things. You can lose the importance of phrases within a text. And even then, when a narrator uses particular accents for things, how we perceive those accents, what we associate with them, can change our impression of the character. A great example of this is Terminator. So Arnold Schwarzenegger has an Austrian accent, very famously. And so to a lot of the audience, particularly in the US and in the UK, were like, he sounded kind of German and scary and robotic. But of course, in Germany, they dubbed him with a different actor. And Arnold Schwarzenegger obviously speaks German, like he speaks Austrian German.
Right.
He said, but I can just say it in German. I can dub myself in German. And they said, no, you have an Austrian accent. You sound like a farmer. And it's because his accent was associated with a stereotype. And if you think there's an author I've had the pleasure of having a conversation with, Andy Duncan, who has a Southern drawl. He speaks with a slow Southern accent. And the thing is, there's a lot of negative interpretations of that accent that someone who speaks slowly must be thinking slowly. And you go, you've clearly never met Andy Duncan. Like, he thinks at the speed of light, but that's how he speaks. He has this long, slow drawl. That's his accent. And you would be a fool to assume that he isn't smart. He's incredibly intelligent. But that's the stereotype about the accent. And so if a narrator is using those accents, that can influence how we read, how we interpret the scene. And if we are reading the physical text, be it in Braille or if we're reading with our eyes, but there's nothing between us and the text. There's no narrator interpreting it for us. There's no one performing it for us. We're the one who is assigning the meaning to it. But if you have an audiobook narrator, they have made decisions. It could be with the author. It could be that they didn't ask the author. Like, we don't know how the production schedule, but they have made a decision about how characters are going to sound, how they're going to perform that voice, how the narrator is going to sound, where they are going to place emphasis and breath pauses in a sentence that may not necessarily follow the text, where what the natural rhythm of their voice is and their accent someone who is from the UK and let's say has a very uh, received pronunciation form of speaking. So they write something. And of course, quite often when we write, we're sounding it out in our heads. So they are writing very much as they speak. And then you have it narrated by someone from New York. They have a different speech pattern. They have a different rhythm than how it is written. And so you can see how the performance of language can add an incredible amount. But because it's doing that, it's no longer the bare text anymore. It's someone's interpretation and adaptation of the text.
Yes.
And that can change meaning. And that's why, like, I'm on record saying that reading a text and listening to an audiobook are two different things. They are very closely related. They are both wonderful, but they're not the same. There are differences, but it's not that reading is better than listening. You're both, you are approaching the text, you are engaging with the text, but in different ways. They have different strengths and different weaknesses. And it's, I sometimes get frustrated when people say, oh, but they're the same.
Right.
You go, they're not the same.
Well,
Quite patently, they're not the same. But people take it when you say that they're not the same, that you're saying that one is better than the other. And you go, well, listening to an audiobook is clearly better when you're driving. Because if someone's driving and reading a novel physically at the same time, that's kind of dangerous.
Right.
Listening to an audiobook is probably better when you're doing the dishes.
Right.
There are all sorts of reasons why listening to an audiobook can be better. They are far more accessible for people with sight issues.
Right.
That's a massive pro for them, but that doesn't mean it's the same.
Right.
When we teach textual analysis, you go, like, here is the text, read it multiple times, and then listen to it as an audiobook, listen to it being presented, we've done this before of like recorded ourselves reading something to play back constantly. Before audiobooks were very, very common. But used to record things because then you could listen to it going on while you were writing something, that you were hearing it again. And you go, oh, I'm going to stop that. What was that? That was that thing. And then you open the book up to find the exact quotation. But you use it as a tool, but it's not the same. And I don't understand why when you point out that something's not the same, people take offense.
Right. It's a sort of defensive. No, I read. I wonder, and I don't want to assume about anyone that argues that they are the same, but I almost wonder if it's keeping track of how much was read in any given time, and if audiobooks are the same as physical books, then those can be counted towards those similar goals. I'm not sure if that's a part of some of the defensive, because I've brought this up with friends and I've gotten similar kind of, it's the same thing. There's no point in wasting your time reading the physical thing if you can just get it done faster listening to it, some stuff like that.
And there are studies that say, we've tested this, people retain roughly the same information. And you go, yeah, because when you're doing it, you're asked, the questions asked are like, do you remember the plot summary? Do you remember the event? You go, yeah. And if you ask authors, so like if I gave you the summary of the events that happen in your book, is that me accurately representing your book? And they're like,
Yeah.
A lot of others go like, no. Like, what about the characterization? What about how it made you feel? What about those? It's not just about the event.
Right.
Otherwise, just read the spark notes.
Right.
If that's all that people are interested in, like, don't even bother getting the audio. Just go and get the spark notes.
Right.
Get a summary of what happened to it and move on. There you go. You now know what happened in that book without having to read the book.
Right.
Congratulations.
Right.
That's not the point of reading.
Right.
I just wanted to find out what happened. Well, I can tell you what happened. No, but I want to read it. Yes. Because you want to experience it. No, I just want to find out what happened. Well, I can tell you.
Wikipedia can tell me.
it's but it's a bizarre thing, and part of it is about assigning value to stuff, and it's about these lists. And at the end of the day, if reading makes you happy, if you enjoy doing it, and it doesn't harm anyone else, do it.
Right.
If it makes you happy and it doesn't hurt anyone else,
Yep.
read the physical book, listen to the audiobook, read the Spark Notes versions, read the Wikipedia thing, because you don't have time to physically read the book. Do whatever you want. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. As long as it is adding to your life. But as soon as it becomes a chore, as soon as it becomes something that you're just trying to get through, as soon as it becomes a thing on a checklist, that'd be like someone going, "Oh, I have to go to 4 art galleries tomorrow because I have to go and see a certain number of portraits this year." And you walk through the gallery going, "Seen it, seen it, seen it."
Right.
I'm just trying to get through as quickly as possible because I have to say that I've been to a certain number of art galleries and seen a certain number of portraits.
Right.
Or you can go to the art gallery and you can look at the portrait, and you can think about it, and you can try and take it in, and you can think about the painting if that's what you want to do. But those two methods of consumption aren't the same.
Especially in a kind of a critical conversation where people might be arguing strengths and weaknesses of the art. It's important to know the person that just ran through the galleries and the person that stayed and kind of stopped and looked at things.
And to be honest, like one of the things that frustrates me actually when I'm listening to reviews is when people don't talk about the fact that they listen to it as an audiobook.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they've listened to it as an audiobook, I want to hear about how well the narrator did. I want to know who the narrator was, and I want to know about their performance. That's an aspect of the audiobook. It's not, if I've physically read a book, I cannot talk about how good the audiobook narration was, what it was like, what voices they used, how they characterized things, what the audio quality was like. Those are all aspects of a book review if you're reviewing an audiobook. And yet so frequently, when people are talking about an audio, they say, "Oh, I did this on audio." You're like, well, okay, can you? And they don't describe that part of the experience. But that's an aspect of your review, and I find it very, very frustrating because there are some amazing audiobook narrators that add an incredible amount, and you go, seriously, you're reviewing this book, you did it as an audiobook, and you can't even tell me the name of the audiobook narrator?
Right.
That's slightly disrespectful.
Right.
You've just listened to this person speaking for whatever, like 40 hours, and you don't even mention their name?
Yeah.
That's a bit rude.
Right. It's like if we'd been talking this long and I was like, "Oh wait, what's your name?" Sorry. Sorry.
Well, in actual fact, I am going to have to go soon.
Yeah. Sorry, I kind of wanted to bring that up because of how long we've been on. I'm sure it's.
I just looked at the time and went, "Oh bloody hell!"
10:44 there, or yeah. Okay. Is there anything like before you go? Anything else you wanted to like just really make sure that you brought up here, or anything about anything at all? I guess.
No, I was just having a quick look there at some of the things that you'd said that we might talk about, and I think like, one of the things that I find interesting is how we individually perceive a book, the meaning that we construct in our minds. That is always going to be unique to us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we also have to be aware that, like the example that we're talking about the lecture, that we can make mistakes. And sometimes we can be mistaken in how we've interpreted it. And it's not to do with what the author intended. It is literally about something happened in a book, and we have projected meaning onto it that is not in the text.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've gone, that's what this is. And you go, no, no, that's not. You have literally projected, there's nothing in the text that supports that. And then they go, but what about this? And you go, right, look at the preceding section. Look at the following section. Does that fit? Well, no, that would stand out. And you go, right. So nothing in the book, apart from this one section, reads that way. Yeah. So either the author wrote a section and the narrator has narrated this section that doesn't fit with the rest of the text and everything else that's being done in the rest of the text. This one section is completely and utterly different. And the author didn't see it. The editor didn't see it. But you saw it. Yes. Alternatively, it does fit with the rest of the text. It does fit with what's going on. But there's something in how you've read it that is wrong, that you've made a mistake in your interpretation of the information. And that way, the author wrote something that is consistent. The editor looked at it and went, that is consistent. And therefore, the error in this instance is actually the reader. Is that possible?
Yes.
And the number of readers who reject that outright, no, but my reading experience is valid. You know, no, your reading experience is what you experience. No one is gainsaying that. What I'm saying is it might be an inaccurate reading of the text, that you have literally misinterpreted something, that you have chosen to interpret information in such a way that, regardless of authorial intent, has nothing to do with authorial intent, but has to do with how you have put that information together. And there's a tremendous amount of pushback on that, because part of it is about admitting that we are not perfect readers.
Right.
And no one likes to admit that they're not a perfect reader. You know, the only perfect reader that exists is clearly me. I'm the only one on the entire planet who is a perfect reader and never, ever makes mistakes.
Which is exactly why I wanted to have you on to talk about this.
And if you believe that, I have this bridge that I want to sell you. It's in New York. And the thing is, we do this all the time. And it's not necessarily that we have literally misread the pigeon fancier. Oh, I thought it said pigeon financier. I thought it was someone who invested in pigeons, not someone who took up keeping pigeons as a hobby. You know, that would be literally misreading the word. But if you miss the fact that they were a pigeon fancier, and therefore this is a hobby, and then later on it goes, and so he was spending times in the coop. Like, why was he keeping chickens? Where do all these bloody chickens come from? You know, it's a pigeon coop. Well, why would it be a pigeon coop? What? Well, earlier on it said he was a pigeon fancier. Oh, I thought that meant he was a sexual pervert who liked pigeon. You know, they're all, and that's a really silly example.
Right,
but
sure.
There are all sorts of ways that we can misinterpret information, or we can look at information that's presented, and because of our politics, because of our ideology, because of our gender, because of our sexuality, because of our socioeconomic status, because of any number of things, we can interpret that information in a specific way, that we might be inclined to view it in a certain light. And any number of those things can affect any number of different things in the text. But that doesn't mean that how we have read it is an accurate representation of what's on the page. That the information on the page we may have misread, we may have misinterpreted, we may be mapping something onto it that isn't there. And that leads us to misinterpret a text. And acknowledging that we are human, that we are capable of making mistakes, that not our every interpretation is not going to be right. I don't know why this is so difficult for some people to understand.
Right.
That, because so much of reading is deeply personal. An author might create a text, and this text sits there. But we as reader are the one interpreting symbols and creating meaning. and then putting that meaning together in our minds. We are the active participant in that. And if we acknowledge that, and if we point out that this is a special position that must be respected, because authors can say, this is my intent, and that's the only thing that counts, because that is ignoring the position of the reader. An author can say, this was my intent. This is what I meant that section to read. And a reader can say, yeah, but that's not how it came across.
Mm-hmm.
So we can know what authorial intent is. And we can go, but that's not how I read it. Ah, I see what they were trying to do. And now I can locate why I read it a different way than what they intended. They said that they meant it to mean that thing. That's not. All sorts of conversations, interesting conversations can happen when we are aware of authorial intent and when we are aware of our own reading, our own bias, our own blind spots, our own cultural lens with which we apply to things. You have really interesting conversations and insights. But if you say authors don't matter, authorial intent doesn't matter, then you're ignoring the fact that the book was written by someone at a certain time and place, responding to a genre at a certain time and place. And therefore, I start to go, well, I'm less likely to listen to your opinion because you're ignoring a huge aspect of the creation of this book. It didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right.
You choosing to ignore authorial intent is a very deliberate act. And if you dismiss it out of hand for no good reason, I just don't care, then quite possibly you're an idiot and I don't need to listen to your books.
Right.
And then when someone confuses reading experience, the evaluation of how they felt when they read it, with how good the book is, that can be a further element where I go, well, I don't need to listen to your book reviews anymore because you're not actually reviewing the book. You're just telling me how you felt about it and the things that you liked.
Right.
And that's not a book review. That can be part of a book review, but that's not a book review. And, I'm less likely to listen to those reviews. And people who just do plot summaries, you go, that's not a book review either. Telling me the number of words in it and how long the audiobook is and what the plot summary is. You go, that's not a book. That's barely even useful information. That's stuff that if I'm interested in a book, I will find out.
Right.
I can read the back cover and get that information. How long is the audiobook? Why is that relevant as to whether or not I want to read it? But again, that might mean, well, okay, I don't need to listen to that person review books anymore. But these are all things that are important to me. And I go, yeah, so these are the things that are important to me. This is how I decide. And then someone says, well, I don't know why you're allowed to say that. You go, so you're allowed an opinion about what you like, but I'm not allowed an opinion about what I like. Oh, sorry, I'm missing the point on this. And again, we've become so fixated on what we personally enjoy is good and justified. And if someone doesn't agree with that, they're wrong. But if what we like, and it's deeply personal, and we all understand that, are you saying that anyone who has different preferences are clearly wrong, even though it's a matter of taste and preference? You don't like that book. Well, you're terrible because you don't like that book. I don't particularly like mushrooms either.
Uh-huh.
Oh, well, you're just terrible because you don't like mushrooms. And I find it bizarre that anytime someone tries to talk about what reviews are and what they can do, it's, well, I listen to that person because I enjoy them. Or, I've listened to I now know what their preferences are after listening to 200 of their reviews. And you go, great.
Uh-huh.
I'm not saying stop listening to them. I'm saying I don't do it because I don't enjoy it. It's not what I value.
Right.
I'm not saying that you have to stop doing it. You go ahead. You've already listened to 200 of their reviews. I hope you enjoy listening to 200 more.
Right.
And yet it's seen as an affront. How dare you criticize those people for doing it that way? I go, I don't.
Right.
I just said I didn't like it.
Right.
That for me, I don't respect that because that's not how I approach a text. Because we all have individual approaches to text, don't we?
Right.
Or is it we all have individual approaches to text, but only the ones you agree with are right? And this is where we sort of come back almost full circle to where we began, which is one of the great things about academia. One of the few great things about academia
What?
is this ability to have these different words with different meanings, to be more specific about what you're talking about. That we don't simply talk about a book being good. Because what do you mean by good? You don't talk about a book being bad. What do you mean by bad? What are your criteria? How are you evaluating this? You don't want to spend half an hour in a video review. These are my criteria. This is how I've worked this out. That would be so tedious each and every time. But what you can do is you can be very specific about how you talk about it. When you talk about the characterization, instead of saying it's good characterization or bad characterization, describe the type of characterization. Give an example. Instead of talking about it being, it was a slog. And you go, right, I've looked up slog, and no one can tell me what a slog is, apart from it was at a pace that you did not enjoy and felt was too slow. So you're saying that the entire book was too slow. There were no fast-paced action sequences. Oh no, there are, but there weren't enough of them. Parts of it dragged. You go, even that is more interesting and articulate and useful information than it's a slog.
Yeah.
Because was it a slog because it was badly paced? Was it a slog because you weren't interested? Was it a slog because really you were reading this as a favor for someone else or part of a book club, and it wasn't the book that you wanted to read at the minute, and you had a lot of other stuff on and you had to keep going back to it, and it was the wrong time for you? There are all sorts of reasons why you're not engaged by a text. The word slog is pretty much useless in describing any of it, apart from you had a negative experience with the book. This book was fire. What aspect? Because probably you don't mean literally. Otherwise,
I mean, there's one chapter in Malazan that maybe fire could be a good descriptor, but
But again, people are free to express themselves however they want. And we think of when we talk to our friends about stuff, because quite often we have a shared lexicon, we have a shared set of cultural norms, we have a shared set of responses and attitudes to things. Quite often, that's why we're friends. We're quite often friends, similar age group, similar culture, similar interests. That's why we've ended up with friends. And so when we talk to them and we say, oh, that was fire, that person knows exactly what we mean.
Right.
But when we record it for other people to watch, when we publish a review online, and let's face it, Goodreads is publishing a review for an audience. Doing a YouTube review is publishing a review for an audience. And you don't know that audience. You don't know how old they're going to be, although YouTube gives you demographic breakdown.
Right.
But you don't know how old they're going to be, what part of the world they're going to be from. So how do you express it? You go, well, this is how I express myself. I'm being true to who I am. Like, congratulations, you can be true to who you are by using other language as well.
Right.
That, when you're at work and you're polite to people, you're still being true to yourself. You're just framing it slightly more politely, or refraining from swearing. Culturally, in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland, you have a lot more casual swearing.
Mm-hmm.
No, not saying that everyone swears all the time, but culturally, there's a lot more swearing. But do I swear in a lot of my videos? No, I try to actively avoid it. Why? Am I lying to people? Is it a false front? You go, no, because it offends some people, and there's no need to offend people. And it's more of verbal punctuation where I am from. It's used as a way of hyperbole, a way of exaggerating something, a way of qualifying something. And an addict, sometimes you swear.
Sure.
It wasn't just great; it was effing great, know. But I'm recording something for people on the internet who come from different cultures who may find that offensive. So why offend them?
Right.
Like, why say something that I know is going to be misunderstood or is going to offend some people? Now, I know a lot of people will go, oh, I know exactly why he's saying that. It doesn't offend them. Great, it doesn't offend you. but we all know it will offend certain people. So why do that? Why annoy people when I don't have to? It's not necessary.
Yeah.
Making yourself understood and heard is important. We live in an age where the internet has opened up lines of communication. Voices that have been ignored or silenced are being allowed to flourish, are being encouraged to flourish, are being included in conversations that used to exclude them. We, we live in an age where self-publishing allows authors that traditional publishing houses ignored or pretended didn't exist, that now there's an avenue for them, that their voices are going out there. They're proving that their stories are interesting. And traditional publishers are taking note. And now they're going, no, we want more people. We want diverse people. We want different voices. We want to see how the different genres can be told in different ways. We want to explore new things. This is all good. But part of that is understanding that there will be people out there who don't come from the same background, who don't have the same experience. And therefore, taking that into consideration is not the same as not being true to yourself, but is taking into consideration you're trying to communicate effectively with other people. And knowing your subject. If you're going to review books, if you're going to talk about books, yes, excellent. And if you're going to review books and you realize you actually don't know a lot about it, carry on doing reviews. But by all means, learn about it. Don't go, oh, I know I don't know a lot about this, but I just don't care.
Right.
But there are so many academics online now, courses online, courses that are free, articles that you can read, that you can draw and go, actually, that's really interesting. That there are all of these people putting up really useful educational videos, 20 minutes, and they'll teach you about this one term. 20 minutes in your week, and you'll learn a new term. You'll learn how to use it. You say, oh, right. Then next week, do another 20 minutes, and you can find out the next thing, and the next thing. And the next thing you know, you've saved yourself a fortune because you didn't go to university for whatever number of years to get an undergraduate, a master's, and a PhD. But you've ended up understanding all of this stuff.
Right. Also a fortune on the textbooks.
Not as bad as the legal textbooks. One of my textbooks, I think, was £95.
Oh my gosh. Oh my
God. But the good thing about literature, about academia, is all of these different approaches, all of these different words, these terms. It's not just about coming up with fancy terminology. It is about sharpening our insight, allowing us to express ourselves more coherently, more precisely, to be able to talk about things instead of bland, generic terminology that is anodyne and bloodless, but to actually convey information and nuanced information at that. And you know what? If people want to do plot summary reviews, let them. But I don't have to enjoy them, and I don't have to say that I enjoy them.
Right.
Just like they don't have to watch my videos where I talk about theme and I talk about my approach to literature and the things that I enjoy. I'm not forcing anyone to watch my content, to watch my videos. I'm not saying you have to do it my way. But denying that my way is a valid way to do things is frankly insulting.
Right. Right. Well, it's what is it 11 over there?
Yeah, it's coming up to my bedtime.
Yeah, I feel bad. I feel bad I've kept you so long.
Not at all. I feel that it's when I get tired at the end of the day, that's when I tend to go off in these rants because it's the end of the day and I've been drinking a caffeinated sugary drink. So I have energy, but it's all fake energy.
Right, right. Chemical energy. Yeah.
And it makes me less circumspect and as controlled as I normally
am. So we know this is the time to get the most.
Well, this is anytime someone does a live stream and they go, oh, hey, would you come and do this? You go, what time is it? Well, I would like to do it at maybe 5 p.m. Eastern time in the States. And you go, right, that's 10 o'clock at night. Or they go, oh, we're thinking of doing it at 8 o'clock in the evening. I went, 8 o'clock in the evening UK time? No, 8 o'clock in the evening US Eastern. And you're like, that's 1 o'clock in the morning. right, okay, well, I'll turn up. And so I'm sitting there, and it's like they're all sitting there going, "It's a lovely evening," and I'm going, "It's 1 o'clock in the morning."
Uh,
Um, and so quite often, like this is the end of my day. Like I've been awake, and you know how sometimes you can be at the end of the day that you're tired and you still want to do it, you still want to engage, and so many of uh, the people who watch my videos, who comment on my videos, the people I've had the privilege to talk to, like yourself, you're based in the US. It it's just a matter of fact, the number of people tends to be more US based, and you go, I want to engage with that, but sometimes time zones can be
right,
a killer.
right.
Um, Particularly when someone says, "Oh, can you do it on a Monday?" And you're,
Uh,
no. Well, why not? Like, why can't you be free on Monday? You go, because I have work the next day.
right.
I have to get up in the morning. If I suggested to people in the US, right, we're going to do an interview. Can you? What if I called you at 11 o'clock at night and we record a live stream? You go, oh, I'm not doing a live stream at 11 o'clock, starting at 11 o'clock. Are you insane? Who would ever do that? Hello, anytime you have it, it's like the number of people who oh, you guys should come over to this. Oh, we're organizing this thing. AP, you should come over to this thing in the States. It'd be great to see you. Yeah, it would. Well, tell you what, why don't we organize it in the UK? You guys can fly over here. Oh, flying to Europe is very expensive.
Well,
But flying to the US is cheap. It's
right.
the same flight, guys.
Maybe they think that you use fuel efficient airplanes coming from Europe.
I swim.
Right, right.
But it's when you think about it, you sometimes, again, and this is the thing, one of the things that reading really helps us with is thinking about things from someone else's point of view, experiencing the world from a different point of view, being able to step outside of your own preconceived norms. Because let's face it, if you live in the States and someone says, "Oh, you should come over to Europe," you go, "God, that's going to be expensive." But if you're in the States and you say, "Oh, it'd be great if our friends came over to see us," because you're not thinking about, "I'm going to have to book flights."
Right.
And you you don't realize that you've just said to them, "You should buy expensive flights to come over here."
Right.
And again, like we do this all the time because we forget about thinking about it from someone else's point of view. And reading is one of those things that helps us understand that. Experiencing stories that tell us about someone else's experience, learning to see the world differently. And one of the great things about fantasy and science fiction genres, so much of what we pick up in a science fiction fantasy world, because it is not mimetic, because it is not attempting to recreate this culture, this world, these cultures, the same technologies, the same way of understanding. There are lots of things that we have to pick up through context in fantasy and science fiction that in a realist novel, we just, it'll be assumed knowledge. But in fantasy and science fiction, it has to be conveyed in some form because it doesn't conform to our reality. Because of that, we hone our ability to understand context, to understand subtext, to understand when we are being manipulated. When an author, a narrator, is telling us something in a certain way so that we see it that way, that we get that level of understanding. We hone our ability using fiction, but especially non-mimetic fiction, because it's a cornerstone of how you read science fiction and fantasy, understanding these things through context. That is such a useful skill in the modern day when we have narrative surrounding us, marketing, branding, advertising, political messaging, news stories,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
speeches, all of these things that if we are aware of how they are convincing us of something, if we're aware of these techniques, it makes us better readers. It makes us cannier readers. It makes us smarter readers. And it makes us more discerning. And so that's one of the reasons why I love science fiction and fantasy. Well, now you have
Oh.
uh, now you'll have it in segments because of internet issues.
Right. Right. I'll just put the like time codes below and I'll say this is the first time the internet went down and this is the second time. Yeah. That's our unique structure that we're using.
I'll tell you this. This never happens when I'm on a call with my wife.
Oh, okay.
It must be when BookTube is being discussed that there's
Oh, okay.
there's a secret BookTube internet gremlin that comes and interferes. Because when I'm sitting chatting with my wife, it is absolutely fine.
Ah. um so you had just said a very like you just kind of put a really fine point on everything. And yeah, I just wanted to say I don't know exactly when I got cut off or when I froze up. But I just wanted to say like thank you for saying all that, and thanks so much for coming on and talking to me tonight. Like this has been so much fun, and I couldn't have thought of a better guest to have as like the first time I talked to someone on BookTube.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting.
Yeah.
Secondly, I'd like to apologize. I went on a number of different rants on this one. And that's because sometimes things get stuck in the back of your head and you know that they're going round and round, and then suddenly they just pop out and you go off on a rant. And unfortunately, you bore the brunt of it, Alex. I am really sorry.
No, it was all great to listen to. Like, yeah.
And the third thing is, it's as much as I rant about things, as much as I complain, like I'm a grumpy old man. I always will be. Modern technology, at the end of the day, I love the fact that we can all go online. I can talk to you like on a different continent. We can talk about books. We can talk about the things that we love. We can have different positions. We can disagree vehemently about a whole load of different positions, but we can still discuss it. And you don't have to agree with me. You might agree with some of my points and then think I'm a complete idiot for the other points. Because believe it or not, I'm not infallible. As much as I would love to claim to be infallible, I'm a tiny bit fallible. I can make mistakes. I do suffer from my own prejudices. I do suffer from my own biases. I do suffer from the fact that I hurt my back and shoulder the other day, and that has made me especially grumpy.
Oh,
but these are things like, because then you don't sleep, and the next day you're a bit tired, and my shoulder is still sore, and I'm like, I'm just grumpy.
right.
And because of that, it makes me more irritable, and then sometimes my mouth gets ahead of where my brain is. But ultimately, we have an opportunity now to learn from each other, to talk. And I know I have talked at you so much. I am so sorry for that, Alex. It was meant to be a discussion with you.
This has been perfect. Like, don't apologize. This is great.
So what I thought we do is at a later date, hopefully when I'm slightly less busy, that you'll come on my channel and we will talk a little bit more, and you will have more of an opportunity to put forth your views on things, because I think that is only fair. I have come on your channel, I have ranted and raved, that you get an equal opportunity to come on my channel and go, you know what, AP, like you said a bunch of those things and you're an idiot. So let me explain why you're an idiot.
I doubt that's the form it would take, but yeah. But thank you so much for the invite, and I would love to come on and chat about whatever, even if you have any more lengthier kind of topics that you'd like to discuss in that as well. I'd love to come on. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the invite. Thank you for having me on your channel, and I hope that you have a fantastic week.
Thank you. You too.